The sacred silence of Arlington shattered in an instant. A fugitive wanted across continents tore his pistol free and leveled it at the tomb guard's chest. Mothers screamed, veterans surged to shield the children, and the cold metallic click of the safety being switched off echoed like thunder across the marble. "Any last words, soldier?" The man snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. The guard didn't flinch. He stood like stone, every muscle coiled, the weight of America's fallen resting on his shoulders. In the next 3 seconds, the fate of the crowd and the honor of the tomb would be decided. Follow this story to the end and comment the city you are watching from so I can see how far it travels. The sacred silence of Arlington shattered the moment Victor Dragan's hand slipped beneath his leather jacket and drew a pistol that glinted like ice in the autumn sun. The crowd froze as though the air had been sucked away. A woman's scream broke too late. A veteran shoved 2 children behind his legs, his cane gripped like a weapon. And there, only a few yards away, Sergeant Michael Carr stood at the end of his 21 steps, shoulders squared, eyes hidden behind mirrored lenses, unmoving. The fugitive raised the gun chest high, savoring the theater of it, his accent sharp, mocking. "Any last words, soldier?" The metallic snap of the safety echoed like a hammer blow against stone. His finger curled, the weight of the crowd's lives pressed into that narrowing gap of time. Michael didn't blink. Discipline held his posture in place, but his senses ran hot and sharp. In another life, he had stood in alleys in Kandahar where muzzles appeared from shadows. He had tasted the metallic tang of inevitability before. But this was different. This was sacred ground. The marble beneath his boots carried more weight than any battlefield. He would not allow a single shot to desecrate it. The man before him was no amateur. Michael noted the stance, the way Victor's feet were braced evenly, his shoulders forward, eyes alive with calculation. This was someone who had drawn weapons before someone who expected to dominate a room by slow, deliberate terror. But Michael had also seen that look, the arrogance of men who thought ceremony meant weakness. From the information booth, Margaret O'Connor's heart slammed against her ribs. She was 68, her hair tucked beneath a volunteer's cap, but her instincts were battlefield-honed. The moment the pistol came free, her thumb had pressed the silent alarm beneath her desk. She prayed the response team was near. Yet she knew, staring at Michael's stillness, that the guard himself was the line no one would cross. The children clutched their flags tighter, eyes wide. A young mother whispered frantic prayers under her breath, dragging her son closer into her coat. The veteran's jaws tightened and one muttered through his teeth, "Hold fast, son. Hold fast." Victor smiled, the kind of thin smile that never touched the eyes. "This is where your empire dies in silence with its heroes doing nothing." His fingers shifted, ready to squeeze. The CZ's muzzle gleamed, the weight of 15 rounds balanced against one man's resolve. Michael's pulse steadied. He inhaled once long and even combat breathing, smoothing his body into readiness. His mind was no longer here, not entirely. It was in the drills repeated until his muscles knew what to do before thought could catch up. Step in, seize the slide, break the line of force, strip the weapon clear, the chamber retained control. Less than 3 seconds. Around him, the world narrowed. The hush of the flags overhead blurred into nothing. The rustle of leaves was gone. The crowd no longer existed, only the gun manned the distance. Victor's smile widened as he saw no movement, no reaction. "Stone," he hissed, mistaking silence for surrender. His finger began to press trigger slack, disappearing under pressure. And then in that sliver between inevitability and choice, Michael moved. It was not ceremony, it was not theater, it was lethal grace born from years of war. His boot slid, his shoulder drove forward, and his gloved hand became a blur of white against steel. The pistol jerked as Victor tried to adjust, but he was already behind the curve. Michael's palm clamped the slide with the certainty of a vice, his body twisting to break the angle. Gasps rose from the crowd. To most, it looked like nothing more than a flicker, a flash of motion, then impossibility. The weapon was gone from Victor's hand, magazine stripped and falling into Michael's grip, chambered, round spinning in the sunlight. The brass pinged against marble, a sound sharper than any scream. And with that metallic note, the tide turned. Victor staggered, clutching air, his smug certainty wiped clean by shock. The veterans leaned forward, eyes alight, whispering, "That's it. That's it." Margaret's lips parted a prayer unspoken as relief surged and the crowd erupted in disbelief. Michael held the weapon safe, the safety clicked on chamber empty. His posture returned to its unyielding line, but the message was clear: the tomb had not faltered, and neither had its guard. The first phase was over. The threat had not been eliminated, but the battlefield had shifted. The next move, Michael knew, would come desperate and bloody, and he was ready. For a breath, the plaza held its silence, as if the marble itself were stunned by what it had seen. The weapon cleared the brass singing against stone. The threat's hand suddenly empty. Then the sound returned in layers, a swallowed sob, a veteran's low hissed, "Good." The flutter of flags like startled birds lifting off a lake. Victor moved first, shock flipping to rage. He lunged in not the theatrical glide he'd effected a moment before, but a jagged, desperate surge meant to close distance and steal back control. Michael met him halfway. He didn't bring the muzzle of the captured pistol to bear. There was no muzzle to bring. He used the tool as mass. The rear sight descended in a tight, ugly arc and met the bridge of Victor's nose with a crack that vibrated through bone and glove alike. Blood came fast bright against black leather. Victor reeled, hands flying to his face, a strangled sound tearing out of him that had nothing of control left in it. A little girl near the rail tucked her face into her mother's coat. A boy older stared with wide eyes over his father's forearm. "Hands where I can see them," Michael said. He didn't raise his voice. Authority didn't need volume. It needed certainty. Victor's fingers hovered indecisive, then planted on the stone to brace his weight. His breath sawed. Yui started, but the word collapsed into a wet snarl. From the information booth, Margaret had already shifted into motion. "Folks, back to the steps," she called through the PA, measured and calm. "Stay together, hands where officers can see them." She moved along the edge like a conductor, keeping time, one palm guiding a mother in stroller, the other signaling two teenagers to put their phones down and move. She did not take her eyes off Michael and the bleeding man for more than a heartbeat at a time. Two veterans slid into a quiet flank at the rail, not crossing it, not crowding the scene, simply standing as old sentries do, present unafraid, useful if called. One of them had a Purple Heart ribbon pin on his cap. The other shifted his cane to his left hand so his right was free. Michael took a half step to his right, widening his base so that if Victor sprang, he'd have the angle to dump him to the pavement without letting the fight drift toward the crowd. He ran the captured pistol through the motions again, not because he feared his own work, but because redundancy is what keeps people alive. Slide locked back. Chamber empty. Magazine in his offhand 17-ounce weight pressing his glove. Safety on. Ejection port angled away. The CZ's finish told a story to anyone fluent enough to read it. Rear serrations polished by thousands of racks, dust cover scuffed. Where a can had likely kissed it again and again, trigger with the faint satin of aftermarket work. Subsonic, his mind noted. Overpressure loads didn't smell like this. If the shot had gone, the first thing the crowd would have heard wasn't a crack, but a flat slap and the scream that followed. He flicked the thought away and fixed on what mattered: Victor's hands, Victor's hips, the tiny measure of his breath. "I said hands where I can see them," Michael repeated. Victor raised them, fingers sticky with blood, then in the way of men who think terror is an acceptable religion, smiled through it. "We're everywhere," he said. His accent thickened where his nose had flooded his sinuses. "You can't stop what's coming." "What's coming is an ambulance for that nose," one of the veterans muttered. It was gallows humor, but it lanced the tension. A few in the crowd exhaled something like a laugh and found their legs enough to move back another step. Sirens awakened in the distance, thin at first, a seam of sound threading the cool air. On instinct, people parted to create paths they didn't realize responders would need. Margaret watched that happen and poured a quiet good into the mic because praise moves crowds as efficiently as fear. "On your knees," Michael told Victor. "I will not kneel for your stones." Victor spat flecks of red, dashing the white beneath him. "You're not kneeling for stone," Michael said. "You're kneeling because you lost." He shifted the pistol to his support hand, his fingers indexed along the frame. Nowhere near the trigger of a weapon that could not fire, and ghosted his boot to the inside of Victor's wrist. Not a kick, not a stomp. A pressure cue, with steel behind it. Now. Victor's survival instinct finally overruled his pride. He dropped. The movement wasn't graceful. His knees hit hard enough to jolt his shoulders. Blood dripped in fat beads onto marble. Cross. Margaret's voice not through the PA now, but close steady. He didn't glance at her. He didn't need to. She read the line of his jaw and kept shepherding the civilians. You're clear. Thank you, ma'am, he said as if she'd handed him a brochure rather than cleared a field of fire. He had flex cuffs tucked behind the belt line of his ceremonial trousers, the habit of a man who knew most days were ordinary until they weren't. He could have waited for uniforms to arrive. He could have kept Victor there at boot point, in a word. But there's a difference between a threat contained and a threat secured. He stepped in, let his knee kiss Victor's shoulder blades just enough to fold him forward, caught one wrist and then the other, plastic ratcheting down with a satisfying finality. Too tight. Victor hissed as if anything in the last minute deserved his comfort. Safe, Michael corrected. For them. He meant the mothers and the veterans, the boy with the flag, the man who would go home tonight and not wake to a nightmare of marble and gunfire. The sirens swelled no longer theoretical. Tires crunched gravel beyond the oaks. A door slammed. A voice called something clipped and competent across the open. Security first charcoal uniforms, sidearms, holstered hands, open postures that said, help, not heat. Behind them, the darker suits and notebooks of detectives, and behind those, the quieter figures who'd fetch camera footage and run faces against databases older than any of the kids hugging their parents at the steps. An Arlington sergeant approached on a diagonal, eyes taking in weapon cuffs posture crowd. Guard, he said, status. Threat disarmed. Magazine retained 1 round ejected on plaza. Michael answered. He didn't move the pistol until the sergeant produced an evidence box like a surgeon setting out a tray. Only then did he lay the CZ into it with the same care he'd have given a folded flag. The magazine separate followed. Action clear safety on, he added, out of habit and respect. A detective was already there, mid-50s, square shoulders, under an off-the-rack coat, eyes with the permanent pinch of a man who'd seen more than he'd admit. Greeley, he said by way of introduction, flipping a notebook. You want to tell me how you turned a gun into a paperweight in what witnesses are calling a blink? Michael kept his gaze on Victor. Clamp the slide, break his line, strip, rack, retain, he said, practice. Greeley's pen scratched. He glanced at Margaret. You hit the panic. Soon as his hand went under the jacket, she said, the set of her mouth loosened for the first time in minutes. I've seen that move before. Greeley's glance warmed a watt. Then you helped save a field full of kids. Margaret didn't take the compliment for herself. She let her eyes rest on Michael and said simply, he did. Name, Greeley asked, flicking his chin at the kneeling man. He spat blood again. You will know. We will. Greeley agreed. He nodded to an officer who knelt and gently angled Victor's face toward a body-worn camera. And so will every camera you smiled into. A tech in nitrile gloves marked the ejected round with a yellow tent, and with tweezers dropped the brass into a paper envelope. In a trainer's office somewhere months from now, a printout of this envelope would hang beside a still frame of a white glove on a black pistol slide, and a caption that said 3 seconds is enough if you make them yours. The crowd, having seen the worst pass without the tearing sound of a shot, began to breathe again. People found words for what they couldn't earlier express. I thought I saw his finger move. He didn't even like a statue. Then, the air filled with narratives stitched from adrenaline and relief. A boy with a flag at the steps lifted it, hesitant, as if he wasn't sure if this was an occasion for waving. Michael caught the motion at the edge of his vision and let a single nod finish what he'd started. You're safe. The boy's shoulders dropped. He pressed his cheek against his mother's coat and watched with the solemn absorption children reserve for moments that might become the first story they tell about the world being dangerous and good at the same time. Victor tried one more tactic, words like knives slipped under armor. You guard stone because you have nothing else, he said thickly. You think this means something. It means they can go home, Michael said. He didn't turn to indicate the families Margaret was still ushering toward the steps. He didn't need to. The truth was visible in the way people moved again, not in panic, but in that unsteady post-scare gait that ends in gratitude. Greeley's radio clicked. A voice on the other end read out a partial match Eastern European national record, like a snarl of wire associates flagged on Interpol lists. "We'll have a name in 10, the detective told nobody in particular, and everyone who mattered." He looked at Michael. "I'm going to need a statement after your relief." "You'll have it," Michael said. His eyes slid once over the plaza, not to admire, but to audit. The line was clear. The mat was his. The watch had been dented maybe by noise and movement and blood, but it had not been broken. "Then let us take the body and the paperwork," Greeley said gently, tipping his head toward Victor. "You take back the ground." Margaret. Hearing that felt something unclench so deep she hadn't realized it was holding. She counted heads out of habit, tracked the last cluster of field trippers with their chaperone lanyards, watched a Marine in a faded jacket wipe his eyes with the back of his hand when he thought no one was looking. "Folks," she said into the PA one last time, soft now, "thank you for your patience. You're safe. Please move slowly toward the steps." The plaza obeyed her like a tide obeys the moon. Michael eased back one pace, then another, transferring physical custody of the kneeling man to the uniforms who'd arrived to do exactly that. He neither celebrated nor scowled. There was no fist pump, no swagger. He reset his hat with 2 fingers, felt the crease of the brim familiar against the pad of his thumb, and turned to face the line. Behind him, Greeley said to a young officer, "Bag the mags separate. Latents will like you better for it." And to a tech, "Get me that brass number and a still from camera 3. Procedure reasserted itself like a house settling after a storm. Ahead the mat waited, quiet, exact, demanding. Michael stepped back onto it, as though stepping across a threshold and into a room where fallen men slept. He found the cadence with the ease of a heartbeat, 21, turn, 21, turn. Not to pretend none of it had happened, but to answer that it had, and that the answer was stillness, then movement, then stillness again. Victor's curses rode the air as officers lifted him, but they didn't reach the mat. Sirens ebbed to a boundary hum. The flags rattled once, crisp as a salute. "Hold fast," the Purple Heart veteran whispered to no one, and to the marble and to the man who walked. "Hold fast." Michael did. The night came down heavy after the sirens were gone and the plaza had emptied of all but those who belonged there. Floodlights bathed the marble in a pale glow. Shadows stretched long across the mat, and the air cooled until the breath of the guards carried in faint mist. Michael remained at his post, every stride precise, every pivot sharp, the rhythm steady as a metronome. To the casual eye, it looked as if nothing had happened, but beneath the order, there was a residue, a weight that hung over the stone and the men who carried rifles and discipline in equal measure. Detective Greeley lingered near the perimeter, his notebook closed for once. He had given his statement to the press in clipped neutral tones. A weapon recovered, a suspect in custody, no civilians harmed. But his eyes betrayed something deeper, a recognition that they had brushed against catastrophe and survived by seconds. Margaret stood nearby, speaking in hushed words to a younger officer, her voice taut with exhaustion. The staff had done their part, but it was Michael who bore the core of it. Michael, who had stood between a loaded pistol and a field full of innocents. Inside the guard quarters, Command Sergeant Ray Whitaker sat at a desk stacked with incident reports. His knuckles were pressed against his temples. He was a career man, silver hair cropped close, his voice usually the kind that settled storms. But tonight he looked older than he had in the morning. He knew tomorrow would bring a chain of meetings, inquiries, perhaps hearings. A tomb guard breaking protocol wasn't the story here, but the question would be asked, how did a fugitive armed with a pistol walk into sacred ground? Across the mat, Michael felt none of that political weight. He carried only the solemnity of the watch. His muscles ached. The hand that had clamped the pistol slide was stiff. His shoulder burned from the sudden struggle. But he never broke the cadence. 21 steps, heel click, rifle shift pivot, 21 back. The silence was his answer to the world's noise. Across a voice called softly from the dark. It was Margaret approaching slowly. She kept outside the line, but her eyes searched him for a crack, a sign of strain. "They're asking if you need relief," she said. Michael didn't look at her directly, protocol, but his answer carried enough. "Negative." Watch continues. She nodded once, her throat tight. He wasn't just holding the line, he was proving something none of them could voice aloud, that the tomb was untouched, that no fugitive, no madness could unseat the silence the guard preserved. Meanwhile, at Arlington Police Headquarters, Victor sat cuffed to a steel chair in an interrogation room. His nose was bandaged, but blood still crusted his upper lip. A detective leaned against the wall with a folder open, sliding photographs across the table, shipping manifests, surveillance, stills names typed in block letters. "You've been moving weapons," Greeley said flatly. "Not just here. Across 3 states. Tell me who you're working with." Victor smiled, his swollen face grotesque. "You think this is about me?" His voice was rough, but the words had a dangerous calm. "I am nothing. A shadow. You should be asking who trained that soldier to take my weapon like candy." Greeley slammed the folder shut. "I'm not here to give you credit. I'm here to shut down whatever else you've planned." Victor leaned back as far as the cuffs allowed the chair legs squealing. "And you think you stopped it tonight?" "No. Tonight was a rehearsal." The words sank like lead. Greeley studied him, parsing the bluff from the truth. But the man's eyes carried no panic, no regret. Only a cold certainty. Back at Arlington, the night deepened and Michael's watch neared its scheduled end. His relief arrived quietly. Specialist Herrera young, but steady with eyes that betrayed both reverence and nerves. He stepped forward with the practiced dignity of the guard, saluted, and assumed position. Michael yielded the mat, his boots finally leaving the granite. The instant he stepped into the guard quarters, the silence of duty gave way to the noise of aftermath. The buzz of radios, the clipped phrases of officers on secure calls, the shuffle of paperwork. Command Sergeant Whitaker rose to meet him. "You all right, son?" Whitaker asked. "Yes," Sergeant Michael answered. His voice carried no boast. It was fact. Whitaker studied him, the pale mark across his glove, where the pistol slide had raked the faint tremor in his shoulders. "You did good, real good, but there'll be questions. You're ready for that?" "Yes, Sergeant." Whitaker exhaled and nodded. "Get some water, sit 5, then write it out. Everything." Michael lowered himself onto a bench, unlaced his gloves, and stared at his bare hands. The weight of the pistol was gone, yet the memory of steel lingered. He flexed his fingers, the tendons tight. Across from him, Margaret appeared in the doorway, eyes soft with something like gratitude. "You saved more people than you'll ever know," she said quietly. Michael looked down. "I just did the watch." But Margaret shook her head. "No. Tonight the watch saved all of us." Her words filled the small room with something heavier than pride responsibility. Michael bowed his head, knowing that tomorrow the world outside would try to understand what happened in terms of reports and interviews. But here within the tomb, the truth was simpler. The guard had not failed. And yet in a dim cell across town, Victor whispered to himself like a man chanting a creed. "Rehearsal." He said again, a grin breaking through blood and pain. "The real act comes next." The next morning broke with a crimson sky, the kind old sailors called a warning, and the marble seemed to drink in the color before the sun burned it white again. Dew clung to the grass beyond the plaza, and the oaks along the ridge held their leaves as if nothing unusual had happened the day before. Inside the security office, monitors flickered back to life with a new relevance. What had been routine feeds yesterday were evidence today. Detective Robert Greeley stood with a paper cup of bad coffee elbows on the console, eyes moving from screen to screen while a tech queued up the exact minute the world had tightened around a pistol's glint. "Roll it from camera 3, Greeley said, and the tech tapped a key. The northeast angle high clean showed the rail, the mat, the corridor of honor. Tourists in slow motion became a pattern of color and posture. Sergeant Michael Carr entered from frame left in perfect cadence, 21 steps, cutting a straight line, as if the stone itself had been measured with his stride. At the far right, a man in a leather jacket did not shuffle or fidget. He watched. He waited. There the tech murmured. He paused the frame and then advanced it 1 second at a time. The jacket moved. A hand slid beneath it. A flash caught the sun, a hard, cold wink that did not belong among memorials. The room seemed to hold its breath even now, watching it on glass and pixels. Greeley tilted his head. "Back 1. Now advance and give me audio." The room's small speakers hissed with wind and distant voices. Then faint but distinct a metallic tick. Not loud, Not cinematic, the quiet final certainty of a safety being flicked off. On screen, mothers folded children behind their legs. Two veterans shifted forward in the same fraction of a second, instinct moving older bodies with a speed that came from long practice. Camera two. Southwest angle showed Margaret O'Connor at the booth, one hand pressing a button beneath the desk, the other already reaching for the public address mic before her mind could name why. Frozen. That right there, Greeley said. Now give me the boy's mother, the one in the navy coat. We have her contact already called, the tech said. She's on her way in. They watched the moment again because repetition had a way of stripping away disbelief. The CZ-75 came free into daylight, held low and deliberate as if the fugitive wanted the ceremony of it as much as the shot. On camera one, the straight-on feed, the muzzle tilted hardly anything at first, almost gentle. Listen, Greeley said. The tech nudged the audio higher. The voice was faint at first, then clear enough to raise gooseflesh even in a room full of professionals who had seen their share of awful things. 15 rounds of truth. Greeley's jaw flexed. He enjoys the theater. He wanted tape to sell to someone who likes to see fear. He rubbed a knuckle across an eyebrow and nodded at the screen. Now here's the pivot. They all knew what came next, but the body never grows bored with relief. The white blur of glove, the step, the clamp, the twist. The pistol severed from its owner as neatly as if a magician had palmed it. The ejected round was a flash of brass and then a tick against stone so pure the microphone made it sound like a bell. He let the video run into the aftermath, the rear sight strike that broke the fugitive's nose, the quick cuffing that followed. Then he looked away from the screen toward the window where morning was pouring itself over the rows of headstones. "Run it again," he said, and drank the coffee as if it could wash something caustic out of him. In the witness room across the hall, Margaret sat with her cap on her lap and her hands wrapped around a bottle of water as if it were a small, warm animal. The boy's mother arrived with that particular post-crisis stiffness. Careful steps. Careful voice, like her body had sanded every edge off in the night. She thanked Margaret without words, then took the chair opposite a junior officer who would take her statement. "Tell me from where you were standing when the gun appeared," the officer said. "Every detail helps." She nodded. "We were near the rail. My son had his little flag. The guard was just..." She swallowed, choosing the right description. "He was like a metronome. Everyone was quiet. And then I heard it. The click. And he said..." Her throat closed for a second, and she gestured vaguely toward the text. "What you just played, the 15 rounds thing. Did the guard yell any commands?" "No," she said. "He didn't shout. He just moved. Fast. Like the sound got pulled out of everything and then that ring when the bullet hit the stone." She closed her eyes, saw it again, and opened them with a sheen she wiped away embarrassed. "I put my kid behind me." The old men moved forward without even talking about it. Their faces. "I'll remember." "Thank you," the officer said. He slid a tissue box across automatically like he had done this 100 times. "That's exactly what we need." Down the hall, Greeley stood in the doorway while Margaret set her water down and gave him a look that said she would be fine after she filed the memory into its proper place. "You pressed the alarm before the draw," he said. "I pressed it when his hand disappeared," she answered. "You learn that tells have a flavor. You smell them." "Were you ever in country?" he asked gently. "Twice," she said. "Once in a place where the dust got into everything you own and once where the mud did." Her smile was small and unamused. Boys who'd never shave again. "I hit the button because I hate that memory and because the guard didn't deserve to do his job alone." "You gave him space," Greeley said. "That's the best thing anyone can give a man in an exact moment." She nodded, grateful that he understood the difference between panic and control. "Those two veterans at the rail," she added. "Find them. The tall one with the Purple Heart pin." He saw it from a different angle. He spoke like a man who's seen men die. She cocked her head toward the monitors. "I heard him tell somebody to hold fast, the kind of words that make people do it." They found him an hour later in a small diner 2 miles away, hands wrapped around a cup that steamed as if fog could be captured and drunk. Ralph Jennings' Army Ratees. Purple Heart won on a road that had never been properly paved in a country too far away. He told Greeley about the muscles in the fugitive's forearm, when the finger began to take up slack, about the way the guard's shoulders told him the moment before his feet did, about the smell that had made him move before his mind caught up with the decision. "It's not loud," Ralph said. "People think evil's loud. Most days, it's the quiet click before the loud part." He heard it too. He tipped his head toward Arlington, invisible beyond the diner's front window. The guard heard it and beat it by a second. Back in the office, the tech compiled the timeline. 09:17:22. The jacket lifts. 09:17:23. The flash of steel. 09:17:24. The safety clicks off. 09:17:26. The taunt. 15 rounds of truth. 09:17:27. Muzzle begins to rise. 09:17:28. Guard moves. 09:17:30. Chamber cleared. 09:17:31. Strike delivered. 09:17:33. Threat controlled. Numbers on a page that understudied a choir of heartbeats. Greeley took a copy of the timeline and walked to the low stone wall outside, where the morning had warmed enough to make the chill an option rather than an inevitability. He read the sheet once through, then folded it and tucked it into his pocket, as if that could put the moment away. It didn't, of course. He turned and looked up the slope to where the tomb stood, and for a breath he saw it not as the press would show it that night. Overhead shots, headlines, screaming chyrons, but as he had seen it yesterday afternoon, a place that took silence seriously and made the rest of the world slow down out of respect. He went to find Michael because paper was not enough. In the guard quarters, Michael sat with a pen and a legal pad. His handwriting was measured block letters, military enough to make an instructor proud. He wasn't writing for lawyers or reporters. He was writing so the day would live somewhere outside his body. When Greeley entered, Michael set the pen down, flexing the hand that had bruised along the heel where steel met bone. "You've probably watched it," Michael said before the detective asked. "I can walk you through what I saw. It's the same." "Walk me through anyway," Greeley said, leaning on the door frame and resisting the urge to take notes. "Tell it in the order your body made it happen." Michael did. He moved his hand under the jacket. "I smelled oil. He wanted me to see it. The safety came off. He wanted the sound to sell the moment." He paused. Saw the rail, saw the faces. He said what he said. "I tracked his elbow, not the barrel." "Elbow tells you when he'll lift." I went on the elbow. "You heard mothers," Greeley said quietly. "I heard children breathing." Michael answered. Everything else was quiet. It's always quiet just before you break something that wants to be broken. "What did the veterans do?" "What veterans always do when they're still useful," Michael said. "They moved without making themselves the subject. They put themselves between the worst and the smallest." Greeley nodded. He said 15 rounds of truth. He said a lot of things that weren't true. Michael answered. "The truth is what didn't happen. They stood in that small room with its simple furniture and its smell of polish and cloth, and the faint metallic note that never leaves a place where weapons have been touched." Finally, Greeley exhaled. "We're going to play that video for people who need to learn what a second is worth." "Play the quiet parts," Michael said. "Most of the lesson is there." Before lunch, the boy's mother returned with a drawing her son had made at the kitchen table, a rectangle of white for the tomb, a line of blue for the guard, a black shape that was a gun with a red X across it and a small flag in the corner. She left it with Margaret, who promised to tuck it somewhere it would live longer than the paper it was on. Margaret found Michael between cycles and held the picture so he could see without breaking the line. "Tell him I saw it," Michael said. "Tell him I'm walking on it." Margaret smiled with the kind of warmth that makes tired people less tired. "He already believes that," she said. He told his teacher. By mid-afternoon, the press had their narrative. No shots fired, suspect in custody. A guard who moved like lightning and like a statue come to life depending on which outlet needed which line. But inside the walls, the story took the shape of shared memory. Mothers remembered the way the safety click sounded like a bell. Veterans remembered the way their bodies answered without permission. Margaret remembered a boy's small hand tightening until his knuckles showed white, then relaxing as the brass ticked against stone. Michael remembered the elbow and the breath between the taunt and the move. When Greeley briefed his team at 4 o'clock, He opened with something unusual for a man who had learned to lead with facts that can be footnoted. Before we talk about names and networks, he said, "I want to say this, the reason we're building a case today instead of body counts is because a lot of people did the right thing in the right order." A volunteer hit a button. 2 vets moved their feet. A mother put her boy behind her. And a guard kept faith with the idea this place represents. Now let's find out who sent the man who thought he could make a graveyard scream. He turned to the board and began writing names, arrows, dates. But the room held a little of the morning's silence, the kind that means respect. Out on the mat, boots struck marble in measured reply. The day before had given them a story they would retell in trainings and living rooms. Today they made sure the telling was honest. The tension had broken the instant steel touched light. Yes. Gasps had rippled. Mothers had shielded children. Veterans had leaned forward on instinct. A safety had clicked off, and a villain had sold himself a line about 15 rounds of truth. And yet in the end, the loud thing hadn't happened. The truth had been quiet, punctual, and absolute. The tomb stood as it had in the morning and as it would at dusk, and the man who guarded it at the moment of decision walked his line as if the world could be stitched back together with 21 steps, a turn, and 21 seconds of stillness. That night, Washington carried a different hum. The city that usually crackled with politics ambition and the endless shuffle of power now whispered about marble silence and a gun that never roared. News anchors leaned into their cameras, their voices soft, almost reverent, as if speaking too loud might dishonor the weight of what had unfolded at Arlington. Headlines splashed across the bottom of screens. Fugitive draws gun at Tomb of the Unknowns. Guards response stuns nation. Clips rolled on every network, the still frame of the jacket lifting the brief glint of steel, the ghostly blur of a gloved hand moving faster than eyes could follow. Talk show panels dissected it frame by frame, as though replay could fully explain the mechanics of courage. But for those who had been there, no broadcast could capture the smell of gun oil in the air or the way silence had hardened into something unbreakable in the 3 seconds that mattered most. Detective Greeley sat in his small apartment on the outskirts of the city, the blue light of the television throwing his features into sharp relief. He wasn't watching the news for facts he already knew more than they did. He was watching for the tone for the story America would believe about itself after staring down the barrel of a gun at its most sacred ground. His phone buzzed on the table. A text: FBI wants in tomorrow. Suspect ID confirmed. We'll brief you at 0700. He turned the phone over without answering. His mind was still with the families who had scattered like startled birds across the plaza, with Margaret's finger on the silent alarm, with Ralph Jennings' sharp instincts. But above all, it was with Michael Carr sitting alone in the guard quarters after his shift ended, staring at the boots he had polished until they gleamed. Michael's hand still throbbed from the strike, the bone-deep bruise blooming purple beneath skin stretched taut by discipline. He hadn't gone to the hospital. Guards didn't excuse themselves for pain. They folded it into their duty. Yet even as his body ached, his mind replayed the fugitive's words over and over. 15 rounds of truth. What truth had the man believed he carried, and what lie had twisted him enough to risk desecrating a place so sacred? Michael's jaw tightened as he unlaced his boots with slow precision. He thought of the boy with the flag. He thought of the veterans who had moved without hesitation. He thought of Margaret's quiet courage. And then he thought of the names carved into the marble behind him, the men who had died without names, without recognition, without voices. They were the reason he hadn't flinched. They were the reason his hand had moved faster than fear. Across the river in a dim hotel room near Union Station, another man nursed a swollen jaw and cursed under his breath. Not the fugitive he was in custody now under federal guard, his nose broken, his wrists raw from cuffs. This man was different. He was the one who had sent him. A shadow figure with eyes as cold as polished steel and a passport that carried too many stamps. He sat at the edge of the bed, scrolling through news clips on a burner phone, his lips curling in disdain. It was supposed to be chaos, he muttered. A shot fired. Blood on marble. America humiliated. Instead, what the world saw was disciplined silence and the impossible speed of one soldier's hand. The narrative had flipped, and now his operation hung by a thread. He crushed the phone in his fist until the screen cracked. Tomorrow he would regroup, but tonight he had to accept a bitter truth. The tomb guard had not only preserved honor, but ruined his plans. Back in Arlington, the boy who had clutched his flag so tightly that morning lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mother had tried to soothe him, telling him the bad man was gone, that the brave soldier had kept everyone safe. But children know when shadows still linger. He whispered into the dark. He moved like lightning. Mom. Faster than the gun. His mother, listening from the doorway, swallowed hard. He wasn't wrong. Meanwhile, Margaret O'Connor sat at her kitchen table, cap still in her lap, replaying every second. She had pressed the button, yes, but she couldn't shake the sound of the click, the safety coming off. It rang in her ears like a church bell. She poured herself a cup of tea, hands trembling, and whispered, "Thank you, Lord, not for her own life, but for the boy. For the families, for the guard who had stood between them and the worst outcome." Morning would bring headlines, interviews, and investigations. But tonight, in the quiet corners of the city, those who had been closest to the danger carried it differently. For Greeley, it was another puzzle in a long career of puzzles, though this one felt heavier. For Michael, it was a vow to guard even harder tomorrow. For Margaret, it was a prayer whispered into steam. And for the shadow figure in the hotel, it was fury that his truth had been silenced by a single disciplined hand. The world was watching. The tomb still stood. But beneath the calm surface, something darker was moving, waiting for another chance. And the guard who had faced one gun might soon find himself staring down a storm far greater than anyone could see. Morning broke gray over Arlington, the kind of dawn where the sky seemed bruised streaks of violet fading into dull gold. The cemetery was quiet except for the rustle of leaves and the steady crunch of boots on gravel paths. Reporters had gathered outside the gates, their cameras trained on the tomb like vultures circling an untouched feast. The footage of the incident had gone viral, overnight broadcast not only across the United States, but streamed into living rooms from London to Tokyo. The world had seen the glint of steel, the lunging arm, and the impossible calm of the soldier who disarmed a fugitive in less than 3 seconds. Inside the quarters, Michael Carr sat on a wooden bench, uniform pressed, his boots shining even though he hadn't slept. The ache in his hand had worsened, a deep purple bruise creeping across the knuckles, but he ignored it. Sergeant Whitaker had ordered him to rest, but Michael refused. His watch had not ended, not truly. Until the questions were answered, until the whispers of conspiracy were quieted, he felt tethered to the tomb like a chain to stone. Across the Potomac, Detective Greeley entered the J. Edgar Hoover building for a joint briefing. He wasn't impressed easily, but the room's atmosphere unsettled him. Federal agents lined the table folders marked classified stacked high. On the projection screen, a photograph of Victor the fugitive flickered into view. His face was swollen from the struggle, eyes narrowed, yet there was no defeat in his expression. Special Agent Dana Whitmore led the briefing. Victor Hale, 38, former private contractor, dishonorably discharged, connected to arms smuggling across Eastern Europe, suspected ties to a cell operating stateside. His attempt at Arlington wasn't random. She clicked the remote, and another slide appeared, shipping containers, manifest numbers, routes linking ports from Baltimore to Norfolk. We believe Arlington was meant to be symbolic, a staged humiliation. But the subject failed. Failed. Greeley's voice was flat. He nearly fired a pistol in the most sacred ground we have. That's not failure, that's too close. Agent Whitmore's eyes flicked to him. Too close, yes. But he didn't succeed, which means his handler won't stop here. This was a test. The word echoed in Greeley's head test. He thought of Victor's smug grin in the interrogation room, the way he'd whispered rehearsal. It wasn't bluster. The man believed it. Back at Arlington, Margaret O'Connor reported for duty earlier than scheduled. She had slept barely 2 hours, haunted by the sound of the safety clicking off. Yet her resolve had only hardened. She moved through the visitor center, arranging brochures with hands steadier than the night before. Parents came in clutching their children tighter, asking questions she didn't want to answer. Was it safe? Could it happen again? Margaret gave them the same line, "The guard is here. The tomb is protected." But deep down she wondered how many rehearsals were still to come. Michael, after hours of silence, was finally summoned by Command Sergeant Whitaker. The office smelled of coffee and paper, the blinds half drawn against the morning light. Whitaker gestured for Michael to sit. Carr Whitaker said, his voice gravelly from too many cigarettes. You're going to be called in front of brass this afternoon. They'll want your account on record. Straight clean, no heroics. Understood. Yes, Sergeant. Whitaker leaned forward, studying him. The news is painting you as a legend already. The guard who moved like lightning. But I need you to remember you weren't standing there for glory. You were standing there for the unknowns. That's what you tell them. Michael's jaw tightened. Yes, Sergeant. The watch continues. Whitaker's eyes softened briefly. You did what you were trained to do. Nothing more, nothing less. But the truth is, Carr, you stopped something none of us were ready for, and that makes you a target. Keep your eyes open. Those words lingered long after Michael left the office. He walked back out into the plaza where Herrera, the young relief guard, was pacing the mat with steady precision. The crowd beyond the ropes was larger than usual, phones lifted, lenses aimed. Michael ignored them. He focused on the tomb, the marble glowing pale in the morning sun, the inscription etched deep. Here rests in honored glory, an American soldier known but to God. He whispered the words under his breath, grounding himself. Meanwhile, Victor Hale sat in his cell at a federal holding facility, a smirk tugging at his swollen lip. He asked for paper and a pen. The guard laughed. What do you think this is, story hour? But eventually, after pressure from his lawyer, he was given a sheet. Victor began to write, each word deliberate, the letters sharp as knives. He wasn't confessing. He was sending a message. Hours later, that message would slip through channels faster than anyone expected. By evening, the man in the Union Station hotel room, his handler, would have it in his hands. He unfolded the note, eyes narrowing as he read only 3 words. Next one fires. The memo that mattered most was only 3 words long, and it reached the right people faster than any press release. Next one fires. By noon, it sat in a clear sleeve on Detective Greeley's desk, photocopied twice, scanned once, and stared at as if repetition might make it less real. It didn't. He slid the sleeve across to Special Agent Dana Whitmore when she arrived with a binder under her arm and a look that said Washington had finally taken a deep breath and decided to worry out loud. Where did you get this? She asked. Intercepted through counsel, Greeley said. The fugitive wrote it in holding. We didn't block it fast enough. He watched her eyes move over the letters, sharp, angry strokes, the kind a man uses when he thinks pen and blade are cousins. She exhaled. He wants us to see it. He wants someone else to see it, Greeley said. But I'm not going to wait for semantics to sort this out. Across the river, in a room without windows and with too many flags for anyone to feel comfortable, Sergeant Michael Carr sat at a long table facing 3 officers in dress uniforms and 2 civilians from the Department of the Army. Command Sergeant Ray Whitaker sat to Michael's left like a boulder set down to anchor a bridge. A recorder, red-eyed on the table, blinked through a short preamble time-place attendees. The panel chair, a colonel with a jaw that looked carved, drew his pen across a legal pad and nodded once. Sergeant Carr. He began, for the record, describe the sequence of events from the moment you identified a potential threat. Michael kept his hands folded. The bruising under his knuckles had deepened to the sort of purple that looks like it remembers a different color. He didn't rub it. He didn't look at it. He spoke without embroidery. I observed a male near the railing, posture and gaze unusual for a visitor, combat boots, even stance, detected gun oil. Hand hovered near jacket hem. I received a verbal advisory from volunteer staff. I continued the watch while narrowing attention to the subject. The moment the weapon appeared, the colonel asked. The subject drew a CZ-75 pistol, safety off. He addressed me. I assessed the angle of his elbows rather than the barrel. When his finger began to take up slack and the muzzle started to rise, I stepped in, seized the slide, rotated to break his line, stripped the weapon, dropped the magazine into my offhand, racked the slide to eject the chambered round, engaged the safety, and retained control. How long? Under 3 seconds. Michael said. One of the civilians leaned forward, a pencil unsharpened in his fingers like a prop. Why not shout? Why not draw your ceremonial rifle across your body? And Whitaker cut in, voice low but iron. Because shouting doesn't stop bullets, and that rifle is not a ballistic solution. He did what we trained for and what kept children from getting buried. Silence settled. The colonel didn't rebuke Whitaker. He scratched another line, then looked back to Michael. Your judgment was sound, Sergeant. We'll issue our formal finding after the investigative paperwork catches us. For now, I want clarity on one more point. After the disarm, why the strike? He lunged, Michael said. He retained capability with his hands. The strike neutralized forward momentum without a shot fired. The civilian cleared his throat, chastened. And your assessment of the subject? Trained. Wanted spectacle. Not suicidal? Michael said. He wanted us to hear the click. He wanted the video. The colonel capped his pen, which in that room meant the conversation was finished. We'll coordinate with Arlington Police and federal partners on messaging. Sergeant Carr, you'll provide a statement at 1500 for the record. After that, back to your post if your commander approves. Whitaker grunted. He never left it. When the room emptied, Whitaker let his shoulders drop, half an inch. You handled that right, he said. They're not out to hang you. They're out to protect their rules by proving you used them. I used what would keep the tomb clean, Michael said, and the words came without heat. That's the rule that matters. Good. Whitaker glanced at the clock. You've got 2 hours before the statement. Get your head quiet. Drink water. And Carr. He waited until Michael's eyes were on his. Keep looking over your shoulder. We've got whispers about a follow-on. From who, Michael asked. From the kind of people who send whispers, Whitaker said. If there's a next one, it won't be a man who wants a video. It'll be a man who'll take a shot from farther away, or someone who'll aim at the crowd to break you. Michael didn't argue. He just filed the possibilities the way a craftsman puts tools back on the pegboard handle, outblade safe ready. Out in the visitor center, Margaret O'Connor returned to duty with a red thermos of tea and a determination that had slept badly but woke up stronger. Parents came in with cautious faces, the kind you wear to a hospital, polite, scared, grateful to anyone in a badge or a uniform. She greeted them with a smile that didn't pretend the world was riskless. Welcome, she said. You're safe here. The rules keep us that way. Stay behind the line, listen to the guard, and if something feels wrong to you, you tell me. A woman with a British accent touched the counter. We saw it on our telly last night. We debated not coming. She looked toward the corridor that led to the tomb, but then we watched the bit where the bullet never came, and, well, my dad served. It felt wrong not to come. You did right, Margaret said, and she meant it. The place wasn't a museum. It was a promise, and promises need witnesses. Detective Greeley found her between questions from 2 college students who wanted to know if the guard ever ate lunch. Answer yes, but not on the mat. He waited until they drifted off and then leaned an elbow on the counter like a man who knows the value of looking less official than his job demands. Tell me you're sleeping, he said. Margaret snorted softly. Tell me you've eaten. Fair, he allowed. He slid the clear sleeve with "Next one fires" across the counter. We're not spooking the public with this, but I'm not keeping it from you. We're increasing perimeter standoff distance, more eyes, more plain clothes. But if you smell wrong, you hit that button. She read the 3 words twice. They didn't frighten her so much as they angered her on behalf of a boy with a flag and a Marine who'd tried not to cry. He thinks fear is a strategy, she said. He's right. So is vigilance. Carr, giving a statement at 3, Greeley said, You going to stand in the back and pretend you can't hear? I'm going to stock brochures and make tea and listen. Anyway, she said, he doesn't need cheering. He needs space to keep doing the job. On the far side of the river in a hotel room that smelled faintly of bleach and cheaper soap, the handler, no name worth speaking, read the 3 words again on a cracked phone screen and set the device on the nightstand as if it were a relic in a church. He'd thought the first try would be enough. He'd thought a nation would choke on seeing its most sacred silence turn to panic. Instead, the silence had held, and his man was in a cell. New plan. New man. He flipped open a leather folio and touched a passport that could be 3 names by dinner. Next one fires meant distance. It meant angles the guard could not reach. It meant he would not feed on theater again. He would feed on shock. He didn't need to shoot the guard. He needed a child. He needed the camera to see the flag fall. The thought thrilled and disgusted him simultaneously. He accepted both as the price of his work and dialed a number that rang twice and then answered without pleasantries. In 2 days, he said, before the news cycle forgives them. Not Arlington, not the tomb. Too much heat. But nearby. Somewhere the guard's eyes overlap with the public's trust. And this time, no speeches. Understood, said the voice on the other end. A schedule pinned itself invisibly to the wall between them. At 1500, Michael stood behind a gray podium in a room with too much carpet and too many microphones. Whitaker stood a step off his shoulder. Greeley took a place along the side wall not for stagecraft but because he needed to see how the soldier carried the moment without a mat under his boots. Michael didn't read a speech. He didn't need one. Yesterday, he said, I performed my assigned duties as a sentinel. A man introduced a firearm into a place where firearms have no place. I disarmed him. Law enforcement took custody. No civilians were harmed. The watch continued. A reporter called from the third row. Sergeant Carr, people are calling you a hero. Do you accept that I accept my orders? Michael said. I walk. I turn. I pause. I remain aware. I protect this ground. Many men and women do that every day, and some did it before me at higher cost than I'll ever pay. Did you fear for your life? Another asked. I feared for the people, he said simply. I feared for the silence. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. You could hear the room shift. Some of the performative edges of the questions softened. Sergeant, a different voice said, federal authorities have suggested yesterday may have been a test. Are you concerned about a copycat? Michael looked at the woman who'd asked it not unkindly. We don't guard because danger is theoretical, he said. We guard because it's real. We'll be here. Whitaker ended the session before it became a trap of hypotheticals. Back in the hallway, Margaret stepped out of a shadow and caught Michael's sleeve with 2 fingers. It was not to detain him. It was to exchange something small that the press would never understand. He sent a message, she said in a low voice. 3 words. I've seen them, Michael replied. Then hear this, she said, stubborn, as only someone who had watched boys die and still come back to volunteer could be. It won't be here? They'll try to pull you away with fear. Don't give them your attention. Give them your training. He met her eyes, and for a moment the guard and the nurse were simply 2 people who had chosen to stand near pain with their hands open. Yes, ma'am, he said. I'll give them my training. The afternoon thinned toward evening, a filtered light slanting across the rows of headstones until each looked like a page in a book the wind was turning gently. Outside the gates, the media trucks settled into their own version of ceremony cables' coiled stand-ups, rehearsed the nightly news, ready to tell America what it felt the day had meant. Inside the mat waited with the patience of stone. Michael returned to it before his shift began, not as a tourist to gawk at his own story, but as a man who needed to check the line the way a carpenter runs his hand along the grain. Herrera finished his cycle, executed the exchange with words that felt more like sacrament than script, and stepped aside. Michael took the mat. Boots found cadence. Breath found count. The air cooled. Beyond the rope, the boy with the little flag reappeared with his mother. He lifted the flag once, half greeting, half salute. Michael didn't nod. He didn't need to. The boy seemed to understand anyway. He tucked himself under his mother's arm and watched the line hold. Across town, a second suitcase clicked shut. A man checked a sight line through a hotel window toward a place where families queued for tours. He didn't speak a word into any phone. He didn't need notes to remind him of 3 words someone else had written. He had his own 3 close, clean, quick. On the mat, the echo of steps answered the things the city thought in secret. 21. Turn. 21. Turn. The night would come again. So would plans that wished to break it. Between them stood the watch. The marble plaza lay under a lid of dusk. Floodlights snapped on one by one, their beams washing the white stone in a stark brilliance that made shadows cling to the edges. The tomb itself seemed to glow, the carved words standing out like warnings written in stone. Michael Carr's boots touched the mat again, the cadence echoing across the hush. He had only hours before been at a podium telling reporters the simplest version of the truth. Now he was back where he belonged, where words didn't matter, only steps, silence, and vigilance. But the city beyond the gates had already shifted. In a hotel 3 miles away, a man with a new name and a fresh passport clicked off the safety on a silenced pistol and set it down on a cloth-lined case. He had been instructed by his handler to wait to study to select a target that would not bring immediate collapse but instead ripple outward like poison in water. He had chosen a crowd spot, a bottleneck outside a popular metro station near the cemetery grounds. It wasn't the tomb itself, but it was close enough to stain it. The plan was simple: draw the guards' attention away, force the nation to ask if sacredness could really stop blood. Detective Greeley didn't sleep that night. He parked his sedan near a coffee shop that closed too early and sat with the radio murmuring static. The clear sleeve with "Next One Fires" lay on the passenger seat, a mantra and a warning. He kept hearing the fugitive's voice in the interview room, mocking, confident, as if the first attempt had been rehearsal. Greeley knew from experience that men who fail but live usually try again. Only this time, someone else would carry the weapon. Around midnight, Margaret O'Connor walked the empty corridors of the visitor center, checking locks, checking her own steady breath. She had volunteered for this after the loss of her brother years ago, and she understood that service doesn't stop with grief. Tonight, her service felt heavier. The 3 words haunted her, and though she had poured tea for half the staff and checked on families until they'd smiled, she carried the unease like an extra coat on her shoulders. Before leaving, she stopped at the observation window. Carr's silhouette passed in strict rhythm, a figure cut from discipline itself. She whispered softly, "Keep them safe, Sergeant," before the glass, and the night swallowed the words. By morning, Washington awoke restless. Papers ran headlines. Silence shattered, honor defended. Talk shows spun debates. Was America safe at its own sacred heart? Would tourists dare to visit again? And across social feeds, a single clip dominated the exact second when Carr stripped the pistol and tossed the magazine aside. People looped it, slowed it, added captions like "unflinching" and "the last watchman." The internet made him a symbol, and symbols are double-edged. Back in the tomb guard quarters, Whitaker closed the door and handed Carr a folder. "Intel says chatter's gone up. Somebody's planning a follow-on." "Not same guy, someone else." Michael looked at the folder, then at Whitaker. "When soon?" Whitaker said. "Could be tomorrow, could be a week. But it won't be another grandstand with a pistol under a jacket. This one will aim to kill." Carr nodded once. "Then I'll be here." "That's the point, son," Whitaker said. "You can't be everywhere. They'll try to make you chase ghosts." The following day brought proof of that. Margaret spotted a man loitering by the entrance, hands buried too deep in his coat. She pressed the silent alert. Plainclothes officers intercepted him. No weapon, just a heavy camera lens wrapped in cloth. But it was enough to remind everyone the place was not untouchable. Reporters swarmed, hungry for drama. "Is Arlington safe?" they asked. "Can tradition protect against terror?" Meanwhile, in the hotel, the second gunman knelt by the window, sighting down his weapon at a crowd entering the metro. His handler's voice lingered in his ear. No theatrics this time, clean, quick. He adjusted the scope. Then he paused because a detail caught his eye. Standing near the stairwell was a tall figure in a black coat, arms folded. The figure wasn't a tourist. The way his eyes swept the space said law enforcement. The assassin cursed under his breath. He snapped the rifle shut and dismantled it in silence. Not today. But tomorrow, he told himself. At Arlington, the guard walked on. The cadence remained steady. Mothers still lifted children onto their shoulders. Veterans still bowed their heads. The silence had not been broken. Not yet. The morning after the near miss at the metro station dawned clear, the air crisp as if autumn had decided to arrive a month early. But for those tied to the tomb, the day began with unease instead of clarity. Michael Carr's boots had not even cooled from the previous watch when Sergeant Whitaker called him into a small conference room tucked beneath the visitor center. The blinds were drawn, and a projector hummed, throwing up grainy stills from CCTV footage near Union Station. Detective Greeley leaned against the wall. Sleeves rolled the fatigue under his eyes, plain. He pointed to the blurry figure of a man lifting a case. "This," he said, "is our ghost. Checked into a hotel 3 nights ago, cash-only false ID. Walked out yesterday with a weapon case. He never fired, but he was there. Close enough?" Michael's jaw clenched. "Why pull back?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Greeley replied. "Could be nerves. Could be he saw me. Could be they're waiting for a bigger stage." His gaze cut to Carr. But make no mistake, he'll try again. Whitaker folded his arms. Carr, you're not to go hunting. That's the Bureau's job. Your post is here. You guard the tomb. That's your oath. Michael gave a short nod, but a shadow of frustration passed over his face. Yes, Sergeant. Margaret O'Connor joined the meeting midway, clutching a thermos of coffee like it was armor. She had seen the security footage too, the assassin's lens, the way he lingered on the crowd before vanishing. Families are scared, she said quietly. I had 3 tour groups cancel this morning. People are asking if they should even come here anymore. Whitaker's voice hardened. They'll come, because this place doesn't shut down for fear. By mid-afternoon, crowds trickled in again, drawn by equal parts reverence and morbid curiosity. Phones hovered in the air waiting for another spectacle. Children whispered to each other, "That's the guard who stopped the man." And Michael, though he kept his eyes forward, heard every word. Fame was unwanted armor. It weighed more than his rifle. Meanwhile, across the river, Victor Hale, the original fugitive, sat in a high-security federal facility. His hands were cuffed, his lips still swollen from Carr's blow. Yet he smiled as 2 attorneys entered the room. "Gentlemen," he drawled, "have you seen the news? I'm a celebrity now." He tapped the table with one finger. "And you don't keep celebrities in cages for long." The lawyers exchanged looks. One slid a file across. Victor leafed through it, eyes flicking over coded lines, accounts of movements, whispers of others who owed him favors. He chuckled. "The play isn't over. My replacement is out there, and unlike me, he doesn't miss." That night, Margaret locked the visitor center alone, the halls echoing with her footsteps. She paused by the glass wall, staring out toward the plaza where Carr's silhouette traced its rigid line under the floodlights. For a moment, she thought she saw another shadow flicker at the far edge of the hedges. Her breath caught, but when she blinked, the figure was gone. She forced herself to move on, though her heart raced long after she turned the key. Detective Greeley, meanwhile, walked the dark streets near the metro station, retracing steps he had seen in footage. He stopped at a bench where a faint cigarette burn marked the wood. The assassin had waited here. He crouched fingers, brushing the mark. "You're close," he muttered, almost to himself. "But so am I." Back at Arlington, the tomb glowed beneath the moon. Michael's voice broke the silence in a whisper no one else could hear. "Not while I breathe." His boots struck the mat again. Each step a vow, each turn a defiance. The city might wait for the next attempt, but the guard did not wait. He endured. And somewhere in the shadows of Washington, the second gunman adjusted his rifle again, whispering to the night tomorrow. Dawn broke with a hard edge, the sky a flat plate of tin that refused to warm. The air had that strange, brittle clarity that makes sound carry farther than it should, and from beyond the gates of Arlington, the city's pulse arrived as a faint, restless thrum. Sergeant Michael Carr laced his gloves tighter than usual and checked the crease of his cap with the same small ritual he'd done 1,000 times a ritual that told his nerves where to stand. The night before, he'd heard the whisper, "Tomorrow," even if it had only come from the dark corners of his mind where possibilities live. He filed it with all the other maybes and stepped toward the mat. Inside the visitor center, Margaret O'Connor poured tea into a red thermos and tucked it under the counter like a secret. She'd arrived before sunrise, keyed the doors herself, and walked the halls alone until the knot behind her ribs loosened enough to let breath through. When she reached the window that overlooked the plaza, the floodlights had just winked off, and the marble had taken on that ghostly pre-dawn pallor. She whispered what she whispered every morning now. "Keep them safe." The glass returned her breath in a pale bloom. Detective Greeley parked his sedan where he could see the metro entrance through a break in the trees and sipped coffee that tasted like old pennies. He'd been there since 5. The clear sleeve with Next One Fires lay on the passenger seat, creased by his thumb. A tactical van idled half a block away, a maintenance logo on its side that fooled no one who knew what to look for. Special Agent Dana Whitmore was inside with a laptop and a knot of agents who spoke in that low murmur that sounds like prayer if you don't listen for the syllables. At 08:30, the first buses arrived, school groups in bright jackets, a veterans association from Ohio, a Gold Star family with faces arranged into public strength. A wreath lane was scheduled at 10, and the crowd thickened in that slow tidal way that makes bottlenecks feel inevitable. Margaret read the flow and shifted rope, spoke to the guides in a tone that made order sound like kindness. Single file, please. Stay behind the line. We'll keep it moving. Michael took the mat at 0900, the exchange with Specialist Herrera, clean as a knife's edge. The air tasted like iron. 21 steps. Turn. 21 seconds. Turn again. He ran the count behind his teeth, let the rhythm drive stakes into the ground of his mind, then opened his senses like windows. Smell, sound, weight. The crowd settled into that hush that always surprises first-timers how quickly the place makes them quiet. Across the river in a hotel room with blackout curtains and a view of the metro's mouth, a man kneeling by a case touched the cool spine of his weapon and felt nothing at all. Not nerves, not excitement. He had ironed those away years ago. The handler's instruction was written on the inside of his skull. No theatrics. Clean, quick. He assembled the rifle with practiced economy, the suppressor turning the barrel into a blunt, ugly line. He tested the wobble of the bipod on the sill, adjusted a hair, and breathed. Through the scope, the world distilled to circles, a mother adjusting a scarf, a boy fidgeting with a flag. A tall man in a black coat whose eyes swept the space the way a teacher reads a room. Law enforcement. He marked him and moved on. He had not come here to duel. He had come to puncture a story. At 0942, Greeley's phone buzzed with a message from Whitmore 2 heat signatures high east of station. Possible optics glare from 7th floor hotel. Unit moving. He didn't waste time with a reply. He stepped out of his car and into the flow of civilians as if he were late for a train. If the shooter had sighted him last time, he could live with that. Better to spook him into a mistake than let him choose his own moment. Back at the plaza, a father bent to whisper to his daughter. "Count with him," he said. The girl nodded solemnly and mouthed the numbers as Michael's boots touched stone with that exact music that belongs to places like this. Margaret watched them from the corner of her eye and felt the knot behind her ribs loosen another notch. That's when a sliver of light skimmed across the glass of the visitor center, a tiny comet that vanished as soon as it appeared. Most people would have missed it. Margaret didn't. She had learned the look of reflected optics in places where it meant a bomb's eye. She didn't question her memory. She hit the silent alarm with her knuckle and without breaking the calm in her voice picked up the PA. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to give the wreath party a little extra room. Please step back to the marked line and make space for families with strollers." "Thank you." The crowd obediently rippled backward. Space opened like a lung filling. Michael didn't look toward the building. He watched the movement peripherally and recalibrated. More room meant fewer bodies, fewer soft targets. He kept the count. The silence thickened. 7 floors up, the shooter hissed a breath between his teeth. The ripple shifted his angles. The boy with the flag stepped behind a bronze trash can, and out of the clean lane the scope had drawn around his small chest. The mother turned her scarf, catching a gust that lifted it into the sight picture like a white bird. He waited. Patience had always been the difference between a job done and a job on the news. He swung left and found a new thread through the crowd, a college kid with earbuds, a tourist lifting his phone. None of it sang to his handler's instruction. He did not want anonymous meat. He wanted meaning. Down on the sidewalk, Greeley felt the hair lift along his arms, the way it does when an elevator opens on a floor no one pushed. He didn't see the barrel. He saw the behavior. A man on the corner froze, not in fear but in focus, as if listening to something inside a wall. Greeley's eyes tracked the line of his nose to the hotel's facade, then up counting windows the way you count heartbeats while you wait for news to drop. 5th, 6th, 7th. He stepped into a florist's vestibule and hissed into his mic. Probable optics, 7th floor east, stacked 2 windows in from the corner. Move on it. Whitmore's answer was immediate. Unit 2 up. Unit 3 establish screen. Do not spook the crowd. Margaret watched a stroller wheel stick against a crack in the stone and was already there before the mother could tug one hand on the handle, a smile that said, "You're not alone." "There we go," she murmured. "Almost time for the ceremony." Her other hand never left the mic. "Security be advised, possible optics glare from visitor center window at 0949. Could be nothing. Could be everything. In the hotel, the shooter's finger moved from along the frame to the curve of the trigger, the slow, practiced embrace that takes up slack without whispering to the barrel. Through the glass, the boy with the flag reappeared, drawn by something only small boys hear: a bugle in the blood, or the thrill of being where solemn things happen. The shooter settled the reticle, doing its small drunk dance until breath and muscle agreed to be friends. 1.5 ounces, and the handler's 3 words would come true. A shadow fell across his scope. Room service, a voice said, too close to the door. He froze, not because he cared about hotel staff, but because operations that go sideways always begin with sounds you didn't plan for. The handle turned. The door opened 2 inches against a metal latch. A hand slipped through thumb, finding the security catch with the confidence of someone who knew what it felt like from both sides. The shooter rolled off the rifle and went low, weapon angled toward the door. The hand disappeared. Quiet. Then a voice he recognized only from its lack of urgency: Metropolitan Police. Step away from the window, hands where we can see them. He had a second to choose. He chose poorly. He fired not at the officer, not at the crowd, but at the ceiling, an instinct older than training, the brain's dumb hope that noise buys time. The suppressed crack thudded like a fist into a pillow. In the second that followed, the mattress blossomed sawdust, and a wall hole sneezed gypsum across the carpet. The door blew off its latch, and 3 bodies tangled with his one weapon, flashing 2 sets of hands, finding elbows and wrists with the map of muscle memory. He twisted, rolled, took one man into the bed frame and felt ribs give. A knee found his temple and made the room lurch. He tasted copper. He dove for the window, not to jump, but to throw the rifle through it and ruin the only evidence that could name his range. He didn't make it. Someone had his ankle. Someone else had the back of his neck. The carpet came up and hit his cheek like a slab. Down on the plaza, a single muffled thud puffed a gray chip out of a decorative column by the metro stair. A child screamed because everyone else did not, because he knew why. Margaret was already on the mic. Stay calm, move to the steps, please. Hands visible, slow and steady. The voice of the nurse in her, the one who had seen field tents sway in wind and heard the small animal sounds of grown men hurt, took over and held. Michael did not break the line. He did not leave the mat. He anchored it. That was his choice and his job. He slowed his cadence by a hair less than a heartbeat, just enough to bleed panic from the air around him. The wreath party waited with their faces tilted up like sunflowers, seeking a sky they weren't sure of. He gave them the sky. 21. Turn. 21. Turn. The sound of his boots clarified things the way a metronome clarifies a ragged choir. Greeley, already moving, cut across the open and let his voice go full command. MPD. Make a lane, you blue jacket, hand off the stroller and move. People obeyed because he gave them nowhere inside the command to say no. His phone buzzed. Whitmore suspect in custody. 1 round fired. No casualties. Sweep underway. He didn't smile. He didn't let anything drop. He scanned for the second threat that always wants its cue. On the 7th floor, the shooter lay cuffed with his face pressed to a carpet that smelled like bleach and cheap cologne. He swallowed blood and spat a red comet onto a floral pattern. He said nothing. The agent said less. One of them kicked the collapsed bipod out of reach with a disgust that belonged to citizens as much as cops. Whitmore stepped past them, eyes as cool as logic. Who sent you? He smiled through the blood. Men like him always think they have one more line in them. You'll know when it fails, he said. Today failed, she answered, and stepped back out of his air. At Arlington, the crowd thinned in a controlled drift. Margaret's hands shook only after the last stroller cleared the line. She put the mic down, leaned her forehead against the cool metal of the counter, and counted to 8. Then she stood straight and did what she had always done, looked for the next person who needed to see a face that didn't flinch. Michael reached the end of his cycle and paused with the same perfect stillness he had shown on a morning that now felt like another lifetime. Up on the steps, the boy with the flag lifted it, not waving, only holding it up like an answer. Michael did not nod. He did not have to. The boy settled and tucked himself under his mother's arm. Both of them watching a man walk a line the world seemed determined to test. Greeley drifted to the edge of the mat and didn't cross the rope. He stood with his hands in his pockets as if he'd only come to admire marble. 1 shot, he said, when Michael passed within hearing. Not ours, not yours, no one hurt. Then the truth held. Michael said. Greeley's mouth tilted. It held because a volunteer saw a glint, because a city moved the way we asked, and because a man on a mat remembered what the mat is for. He tipped his chin. We'll talk later. There's a handler who won't like being disappointed twice. The morning steadied. The wreath laying began. Soft commands, exact movements, hands meeting, ribbon heads bowed. The tomb received the gesture the way it receives everything, without commentary, with dignity, as if it were a well that collects all the water that spills from the world and still stays clear. The city beyond the gates adjusted its collar and went on being itself. Inside the watch continued not louder, not faster, but truer, because the quiet had been challenged and had refused to break. The city's pulse had settled into something like normal, but inside the command post the air was all clipped sentences and steady fingers tapping keyboards. Special Agent Dana Whitmore stood at the center headset balanced over her dark hair, one hand cupped over the earpiece, as she sorted a dozen streams of information into a shape she could use. Shooters in custody. No casualties, came the voice from the 7th floor hotel. Copy. Transport secure, Whitmore asked. Affirmative. He's resisting, but minor. Whitmore gave a short nod. She didn't allow relief to loosen her spine, not yet. An operation never ended with the first man in cuffs. That was when the real threat usually started, the second blade hidden behind the first. She gestured toward a map pinned across the wall. Red dots bloomed like a rash across the blocks surrounding Arlington. Sweep every perch. If this was staged for chaos, we don't assume it's a lone actor. Detective James Greeley leaned against the edge of a table. The lines in his face deepened by the fluorescent light. He had traded the raw field air for the stale hum of electronics, but his eyes hadn't softened. He held the shooter's words like a stone in his pocket. You'll know when it fails. That wasn't bravado. It had the weight of someone convinced of his role in a larger play. Margaret O'Connor sat in a chair at the far end of the room, still in her visitor center uniform, hands clenched around the cooling thermos of tea. Whitmore had asked her to stay. You saw the glint first. Tell me what you noticed. Margaret replayed the memory, the sliver of light skimming across glass, the reflex to press the alarm. Her voice carried the quiet steadiness of a nurse who had told soldiers harder truths. It was instinct, too clean a shine, too precise. It was like catching sight of a scalpel in a sunbeam. Whitmore scribbled a note. That instinct might have saved 50 lives. She let the silence rest for a second, not out of sentiment, but because Margaret deserved acknowledgement. Then her tone sharpened. We need eyes on every camera, every comms intercept, every reservation list for hotels with a line of sight to the plaza. If there's a second shooter, I want him before he chooses his moment. Greeley pushed off the table. You think this was a decoy fire around to cause panic, and while everyone's eyes are up, the real strike comes sideways? Whitmore nodded once. Classic misdirection. The handler doesn't care if the first man goes down. He cares that we start chasing shadows while the knife goes in somewhere else. Margaret's throat tightened. Somewhere else? You mean another target in the city? Or here, Whitmore said grimly. Meanwhile, Sergeant Michael Carr had not left the mat. His cadence slowed only by imperceptible hairs of time, his face carved in the marble of his oath. He had seen the ripple, heard the faint thud against stone, felt the crowd tense as if about to bolt, but he remained. Now as the ceremony concluded and the wreath lay in its circle of silence, he knew he carried more than the memory of fallen soldiers. He carried the fragile trust of a shaken crowd. Children clutched their parents tighter. A veteran muttered, God bless that guard, and saluted with a trembling hand. For Michael, those ripples mattered less than the line under his boots. The line must not break. At 10:15, the suspect was dragged through the back corridor of the hotel, wrists, cuffed eyes swollen where fists had done their work. His lips bled, but still twisted into something like a smirk. An FBI agent shoved him into the van. Greeley watched from the curb, arms folded. He leaned closer to Whitmore. He's too calm. Men like him don't smile when their operation collapses. They smile when they know we're already behind. Whitmore's eyes hardened. We'll see how long that smile lasts when he's under lights. But deep in the fugitive's pocket, stitched into the seam of his jacket, was a second phone thin enough to pass casual searches. It pulsed silently with one text already queued, waiting only for his captors to move far enough for the signal to climb. 4 words written in a dead language of handlers and pawns. Stage 2 commenced now. Back on the plaza, Margaret moved through the thinning crowd, guiding the last groups toward the buses. Her voice was calm, her smile patient, but her ears were tuned for something else, the rhythm that had changed once already. She caught sight of Michael unbroken in his guard, and the sight rooted her when the panic wanted to creep back in. If he could stand still, she could breathe steady. But just as the buses pulled out, a ripple of unease traveled the other direction, commuters pointing toward the metro entrance. Margaret followed their gaze. A man in a gray hoodie had stumbled on the steps, dropping a black duffel. He snatched it up too quickly, hugging it to his chest, eyes darting as if measuring distance. The security volunteers began to move, but the man bolted, vanishing into the tunnel with the duffel bouncing against his hip. Margaret's blood iced. She had seen that posture in war zones. It was not the walk of a tourist. It was the run of someone about to bring fire into the dark. Above Whitmore's comms crackled. Unattended male metro entrance. Possible device. Greeley swore under his breath and started running. And in the van, the captive fugitive laughed low and guttural. "Now you'll know," he whispered. For a heartbeat, the whole plaza seemed to tilt toward the metro entrance, as if gravity itself had shifted down those stairs where the gray hoodie disappeared with the black duffel drumming his thigh. The conversations that had just begun to bubble back after the 7th floor arrest flattened into a hush that hurt. Somewhere a stroller squeaked. Somewhere else a flag snapped once hard like a small explosion that wasn't. Margaret didn't shout. She had learned a lifetime ago that panic is a contagion, so is calm. She lifted the mic with a steady hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to create space. Please walk, don't run toward the steps. Keep your hands visible and follow the instructions of security staff." She set the mic down, then keyed the private channel. Possible device metro stairwell. Male gray hoodie, black duffel. "He's moving." Copy came Whitmore's voice already clipped into operational speed. "Shut the station. EOD en route. Greeley." "Your point." "I'm on him," Greeley said, already cutting through the human tide badge, flashed voice turning corridors into lanes. "Police make a path." The entrance swallowed him, fluorescent light tile echo, the metallic tang that belongs to all tunnels. He hit the escalator at a jog, taking the steps 2 at a time. Halfway down, he saw the hoodie at the far end of the mezzanine, the duffel tight against the man's chest, his head jerking in quick, ugly arcs. Not lost. Counting cameras. Counting cops. MPD Greeley's voice cracked across tile. "Put the bag down. Hands where I can see them." The hoodie didn't obey. He didn't run either. He walked briskly toward the far stairwell, not reckless, not urgent, terminally deliberate. Greeley's stomach tightened. Men with bombs run from fear, or they walk like this from certainty. Outside on the plaza, Michael Carr did not move toward the metro. He wanted to. Every muscle argued for it, but the mat held him. The tomb held him. His oath had never been heavier. He shifted his focus without shifting his posture, peripheral full scan counting bodies, watching hands. He heard Margaret's measured instructions. He saw the wreath party stop, and then continue on cue, shepherded by officers who'd made it look like part of the show. He let his cadence grow audible, a metronome to remind frightened nervous systems where they were. A veteran with a Purple Heart pin slipped to the rope as if to guard the guard. He didn't cross. He just stood eyes on the tomb jaw set. Michael felt the weight of that wordless company settle into place beside him like a brace against a door in a hard wind. Down in the tunnel, the hoodie hit the next landing and vanished. Greeley cut after him, radio in his left hand, right hand hovering near his holster without drawing. He didn't want a stray shot bouncing down ceramic and turning panic into stampede. "Shut the platforms," he barked. "Lock the turnstiles. Pull the power if you have to." A station manager pale nodded and began hitting switches with hands that somehow didn't shake. Eyes on the bag, Whitmore demanded in his ear. "Affirm," Greeley said, breath even, subject turning west concourse. "He's not looking for a train. He's looking for a crowd." "Units 2 and 4 box him," Whitmore said. 3 flood the stairwells. Use your voice. Calm, not panicked. They moved like a choreographed answer to a test bodies in ordinary clothes with not ordinary eyes, station staff, whose name tags suddenly meant more than tickets. The concourse bled down to emptiness. The hoodie reached the end of a corridor and found a rolling steel door already dropping. He pivoted quick, and there was Greeley not with a gun in a two-hand stance, but with one palm open and set low, the posture that tells a person running out of options there might still be one more if he doesn't commit to the worst. It doesn't go the way you think, Greeley said. Set it down and back away. Nobody gets famous today. The hoodie's eyes were wrong, the pupil's huge breath hitching, sweat beating his upper lip. He wasn't the seventh-floor shooter's iron. He was tinder. He looked past Greeley, past the dropping door, past the whole geometry of the station, and saw nothing to live for. His fingers cinched on the strap. Stop, Greeley said, and put steel in the word. This is the last calm moment in your life. Use it. The hoodie licked his lips. He looked down the hall, left right up, like the world might present a different version of itself if he stared hard enough. Then he did the thing no one wanted. He set the bag down too fast and stepped back with too much relief. Greeley's blood cooled. People who mean to blow something don't look relieved to put the bag down. They look like gravity has finally let go. Back, Greeley said softer. Hands up. They cuffed him against tile as the bag sat between them like a heartbeat. EOD would own it now. Greeley backed away, radio up. Subject in custody. Device unknown. On the plaza, Margaret took 2 steps toward the metro mouth and then caught herself. She turned instead and scanned the opposite flow, the one that always gets ignored when everyone's eyes drag toward the sirens. A man in an EMT jacket stood at the edge of the rope talking quietly to a cluster of tourists. His jacket was right. His posture wasn't. Shoulders tight, feet set too square. She watched the way he used his hands. Reassurance with the palms forward, yes, but the fingers curved like they missed the weight of something. Ma'am, he called to her, seeing her see him. He lifted his chin in a tired smile. We're setting up a triage tent just in case. Need to move these folks across the line to the shade. He gestured with a lazy, professional confidence that felt like it had been rehearsed in a mirror. Which service? Margaret asked, pleasantly, strolling closer, as if to help. City EMS, he said. West Unit. Margaret's eyes flicked to the patch on his shoulder and then to the badge clipped to his belt on a retractable reel. The patch was a recent design. The badge was last year's colors. Minor, human, easy to miss if you don't collect little mismatches for a living. Which hospital are you routing to? She asked conversationally. The man's smile pinched. GW, he said quickly. Of course, Margaret said. Which side of the river? His gaze slid. It's a small thing, a half-second slip, but it's the kind of tell that has saved people since poker was invented. The veteran at the rope watched Margaret watching the man and angled his body, not aggressive, simply ready. Let me get my supervisor, Margaret said, and didn't move. She met the man's eyes and let him wonder why the moment hadn't progressed the way most interactions with harried volunteers do. Behind her, Michael's cadence went on each strike of boot on marble, a kind of jurisdictional claim over the space where Lies wanted to set up shop. Ma'am, the fake EMT said more firmly, we need to move them, now, and we will. Margaret said, voice easier than a summer porch. After you call in your unit and tell us on which channel we can confirm. His jaw tightened. Too much. His hand dipped toward the badge reel as if to show it again to pull focus where he wanted it. The veteran at the rope lifted one hand chest-high palm toward the sky, a small old signal soldiers use to say, hold, without alarming anyone who doesn't speak that language. Margaret didn't look away. Channel, she repeated lighter. The EMT's gaze flicked left toward a service gate where a catering truck idled. That was the mistake. Margaret's radio was already at her lip. Security to East Service Gate, she said. Unverified EMT, possible false credential, quiet approach. The man read it coming and made his choice. He didn't go for a weapon there might not have been one. He went to slip the rope, counting on surprise and the natural human instinct to open gaps for anyone in a uniform. The veteran's cane came up not as a strike, just as a bar, and the old man's voice arrived with the kind of authority crowds still listen to. Stay where you are, son. 2 plainclothes officers appeared out of nowhere, the way good security does when it's been asked not to be seen. Sir One said smoothly, let's confirm your credentials. The EMT betrayed himself not by running, but by freezing. Flight is noisy, fake professionalism is sometimes louder. They took his elbows, turned him, walked him toward the gate with the quiet efficiency. People barely notice until the moment has passed. The catering driver blinked at the sudden entourage and then found something fascinating to do with his manifest. In the tunnel, EOD rolled a small tracked robot toward the bag camera eye, winking. The gathered officers drew back shoulders, pressing tile breath, held the way people hold it when fireworks are late. Through the monitor, Greeley watched the claw nudge the duffel's zipper. It snagged, tugged, and peeled like a wound dressing. Inside a tangle of wire, a cheap phone, a lump wrapped in tape. The robot nosed it, lens zooming. Reading, Greeley asked without moving his lips. Low, the tech murmured. Could be a hoax package. Could be a lot of tape and air. Or could be designed to look like a hoax, Greeley said, because experience had made him mean. Run the disruptor. They did a small pop that puffed dust and made 2 rookies flinch. The bag slumped. The phone's screen cracked into spiderwebs. The lump tore open to reveal clay. Brown, inert, insultingly ordinary. Hoax designed to eat a morning. Designed to move eyes away from a service gate where a man in a wrong jacket wanted to shepherd people into the wrong place. Greeley's laugh was a single syllable with no humor. He keyed Whitmore. Stage 2 is smoke and mirrors, hoax device. We've got a live attempt topside false EMT. Already on it, Whitmore replied. Good catch on both fronts. Bring your hoodie up. I want to see if his script matches. They walked the hoodie back, cuffed head-down shoes squeaking on wet tile where a mop had been abandoned in the rush. On the mezzanine level, the station manager leaned on a console with both hands, looking like he'd aged 6 months since the switch pull. Greeley touched his shoulder in passing. You did right. It was a sentence people remember their whole lives. On the plaza, Margaret exhaled a breath she didn't know she'd locked. She looked at the veteran and let her mouth soften into something that wasn't quite a smile. You still read a room. Muscle memory, he said, then shrugged as if the body learned what it needed to if you gave it time. His eyes slid to the mat. And that's a man who keeps the meter for all of us. Michael reached the end of his cycle and paused. The quiet he held in his body radiated 10 yards and neutralized the anxious talk that wanted to start. In his peripheral vision, he saw the officers walking the fake EMT away. Farther off, he saw the line reform at the metro when the gates reopened slow, orderly, alive. He did not allow himself either pride or relief. He stored the data and walked. Across town in a room with no windows and a table too clean, the handler watched 3 feeds at once, hotel corridor, metro concourse, cemetery gate. His mouth ticked once. Annoying, he said to no one. He didn't swear. Professionals don't waste language. He powered down one screen and tapped a message with 2 fingers. Adapt. Tonight, no cameras. Back under the oaks, a boy held his small flag shoulder high and looked up at his mother. Is it over? He asked. For now, she said honestly, because she was done lying to her son about the world. But look. She tilted her chin toward the mat. He's still walking. The boy watched, spellbound again by the rhythm, as if 21 could be a spell against chaos. Michael counted the steps not because he needed to, but because the count kept the day stitched. 21, turn, 21, turn. The tomb received the wreath. The plaza breathed. The city kept moving. In the command post, Whitmore lowered her headset and finally rolled her shoulders. We didn't lose anyone, she said low, as if unwilling to break the spell. Not today, Greeley answered, setting the hoax components on a table where they looked stupid and small. Today, we just had to win twice. Margaret set the red thermos between them like an offering. Drink, she said, then do it again. Outside, the sun cleared the edge of a stubborn cloud and poured a clean light over marble. The guards' boots answered with their old exact music, and the morning which had threatened to tear held. By mid-afternoon, the cemetery grounds had settled into that deceptive calm that only veterans of long watches recognize. The air looked ordinary again, sun slanting through oaks, the tomb wrapped in stillness. But in the command post, every monitor, every headset, every clipped conversation carried a strain you couldn't see on marble. Everyone knew the handler hadn't been finished. Men like him never accepted stalemates. They treated them like invitations. Whitmore leaned over the table. Eyes on 3 feeds at once. The fake EMT being booked, the seventh-floor shooter being processed, the hoodie slumped in holding with a sullen silence that refused to harden into words. 2 decoys, she murmured. Which means we still haven't seen the main act. Greeley rubbed the heel of his hand across the back of his neck. Or the act is to burn our time until everyone's nerves fray. Margaret shook her head. You don't stage this many layers just to spook a crowd. Someone wanted distraction to clear space. That space hasn't revealed itself yet. Outside, Michael Carr's cadence went on. He had been on the mat for hours, but to the tourists who rotated in and out, to the children who pressed against the rope, to the veterans who held their caps in hands, it looked as sharp as the first. That was the duty unbroken line, unbroken sound. What most didn't know was the toll. Sweat crawled the back of his neck under the collar. His calves burned. His ribs ached from the sheer discipline of breathing at exactly the same measure. And yet his mind scanned in quiet arcs, corners, shadows, unmarked vans, people who watched too little or too much. Near the service road, a white delivery van idled, logoed with a catering company whose trucks had already passed muster once that morning. Its driver smoked with a lazy boredom that looked almost staged. Margaret's eyes narrowed. That van. Has anyone confirmed its manifest? A young officer checked her clipboard. We cleared a catering vehicle at EO 9:30. Not sure if it's the same plate. Then we're going to find out. Margaret set off, not with the speed that spooks, but with the steady gait of someone who belongs. Greeley peeled off to flank his bulk, softened by the way he held his shoulders loose, as if just another tourist cutting across grass. The driver stubbed his cigarette. He saw Margaret coming and shifted his weight, not enough to flee, just enough to set her teeth on edge. Afternoon, he said, accent blurred, smile too quick. Got held up at the gate earlier. They told me, wait here, another check. Margaret smiled back with a warmth that would have fooled anyone not trained to feel the temperature under words. That's odd, she said. Which officer told you that… the tall one? He said, snapping his fingers as if the detail were obvious. Dark hair. Greeley came around the bumper. Name. The driver's mouth opened, closed. He touched his back pocket as if a clipboard might be there. It wasn't. That was all Greeley needed. His hand closed on the van's latch before the driver could move. The doors swung wide. Inside, trays of stainless chafing dishes gleamed, too clean, too empty. Beneath them, black plastic bins nested in rows. Margaret's throat went cold. She didn't touch them, just read the labels on tape that hadn't been aged by kitchen life. C4, date cord, timers. The driver's hand twitched toward his belt. Greeley moved first, pinning him against the door with a forearm like iron. Not today, he growled the same words the tomb had seemed to whisper that morning. Alarms went up on every net at once. Confirmed device, East Service Road. Evacuate outer perimeter. Whitmore's voice cut steady across channels. EOD priority. Lock this sector down. Michael Carr heard none of it in words. He felt it in the shift of air, the way radios hissed the sudden tension in posture around the rope line. His cadence did not break, but behind his fixed eyes he counted new variables, the crowd being edged farther, the subtle pivot of rifles under jackets at the corners, the shadow of a white van against the trees. Families shuffled, confused but compliant, shepherded by calm voices. A little girl asked her father if the soldier would leave too. The father said, "He doesn't leave." Michael's ears caught it, and for a moment the weight of expectation felt like a physical cloak. He bore it. He turned. EOD teams arrived like surgeons, each movement clipped into ritual. The bins were slid one by one into containment vessels. Each label was real. Each package wasn't. Clay again, brick dust, wire that didn't connect. The handler was mocking them, teaching them to dance for ghosts. Whitmore's knuckles pressed white on the table. He's making us chase shadows. Until what Greeley demanded. Until the real package walks through the front gate, Margaret's mind flashed through the day, the shooter, the hoodie, the EMT, now the van. He's bleeding our attention in 4 directions, which means the 5th is already moving. And somewhere beyond the reach of cameras, the handler closed his last phone and slipped into a crowd that didn't know they were carrying him. He had only one piece left to play, and the tomb had not yet fallen silent. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the marble steps, bathing the tomb in gold. Tourists still lingered at the rope line, their murmurs subdued after hours of tension. The mat gleamed from Michael Carr's precise boots, his cadence never once faltering. To the crowd, he was the still point in a day that had twisted like a storm. But inside the command post, a storm of another kind brewed, an invisible clock, ticking pieces clicking into place that no one could yet see. Special Agent Dana Whitmore stood in front of the operations board, every intercepted call and sighting pinned like veins across a map. "We've neutralized 4 vectors," she said, voice tight. "Shooter, EMT imposter, hoodie, van. All duds, all decoys, which means—" Detective James Greeley finished the thought. "The main strike hasn't happened yet." Margaret O'Connor sat nearby, her face pale under the fluorescent light. Her nurse's instincts didn't rely on tactical theory, just on human rhythms, and something in the rhythm of the day had been wrong. "You don't lay this many layers without an end game," she said softly. "He's pushing us to spread thin until the center breaks." Whitmore turned toward her. The center. Margaret's eyes lifted toward the screen showing the tomb guard's feed. Michael Carr pacing, turning rifle across his shoulder. "That's the center. All of this, the distractions, the noise, it's to make that image crack. To break the thing no one believes can break." The word sent a chill through the room. At that exact moment, a call cut through on a secure line. Possible armed suspect west approach, refusing to stop for secondary screening. Whitmore's heart clenched. Description: male. Early 40s, dark jacket, moving with purpose. No ID, he's inside the perimeter. The command post snapped into motion. Radios hissed, agents dispatched. But the camera feed already showed it, a man striding down the slope, ignoring shouted orders, his hands clenched at his sides. The crowd stirred, uncertainty flashing into fear. On the mat, Michael saw him too. His eyes didn't shift, but his mind calculated. The man's shoulders were hunched in that predator coil, his steps measured like someone counting down. Every fiber screamed danger. The suspect drew closer, the rope line quivering as parents pulled children back. 2 uniformed officers rushed from the flank, but the man shoved through, eyes locked on the marble platform. His voice broke out ragged and sharp. "Your guard is a lie. Today, the silence ends." Gasps rippled. Cameras came up. The man reached into his jacket. Michael's body reacted faster than thought. In one seamless pivot, he swung his rifle down, stance, solid voice erupting across the plaza. "Halt." The crack of authority slammed through the air. For a moment, time itself froze, the man's hand still buried in his coat, the crowd holding its breath, the soldiers at the edge ready to fire. Then the jacket parted and metal gleamed. A pistol. Screams split the quiet. Parents ducked, children shrieked, bodies hit the ground. But Michael Carr did not move from his post. His rifle was leveled, finger steady, his eyes burning into the suspect. "Drop it." "It." For a heartbeat, the man hesitated. Then instead of aiming at the guard, he swung the pistol skyward and fired 2 deafening shots into the air. Chaos exploded. The plaza erupted into panic, people rushing, soldiers shouting, radios blaring. But Michael's voice cut through it all again, steady as granite. "Drop the weapon." The suspect's eyes flicked wide and wild, and for the first time a shadow of uncertainty crossed his face. Agents surged forward. Greeley was among them, tackling the man hard against the ground. The pistol skittered across the stone. Whitmore's voice thundered in everyone's ear. "Suspect down! Secure the scene!" The suspect thrashed, spitting words through clenched teeth. "You're too late! You can't guard everything." Margaret, heart hammering, saw it too, the look of someone who still believed the real fuse hadn't been lit. And then she realized the entire plaza's attention had swung west toward the man with the pistol, which meant the eastern flank, the one now thinly guarded, lay exposed. Her gaze snapped there. A lone figure in maintenance overalls, head bowed, pushing a cart closer to the tomb. Too close. Margaret's voice tore from her throat. "The cart! Stop that cart!" Every head turned, and in that fraction of a second, the handler's true play began to reveal itself. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. Margaret's cry seemed to hang over the plaza like a flare. Then the world snapped into motion. The maintenance cart bumped off the service path and angled toward the tomb, squeaking wheels catching on the grooves between stones. The man behind it kept his head down, cap pulled low, reflective vest blurring into the glare. Too fast for maintenance, too close to sacred ground. Michael didn't need Margaret's voice to tell him what his body already knew. He broke cadence. It didn't look dramatic. It looked inevitable. One step carried him off the mat, then two, the ceremonial rifle sliding from his shoulder into a ready grip. Not to fire, it carried no round, but to become leverage. Hold the line, he barked toward the rope voice, carrying like a command through heavy air. Back, clear the plaza. The veterans closest to the barrier echoed him without thinking. Old muscle memory turning men into beacons. Parents pulled children. Guides became shepherds. Space opened. Metro units hold fast. All eyes east. Whitmore's voice crackled across every radio at once. EOD inbound. Do not touch the load. The cart rattled over the last seam of stone. Michael stepped inside its arc and planted the butt of his rifle into the right front wheel, the iron heel wedging against rubber and steel. The wheel bucked. The cart slewed a quarter turn and scraped to a stop, now angled away from the tomb steps and toward an open swath of marble. Not disabled, not safe, but no longer on a straight path to the heart. Hands up, he snapped at the man in the vest. The man's head came up at last. The face underneath wasn't maintenance. It was tight, gray-eyed, young enough to run and old enough to decide not to. His hands rose halfway, then jittered at his chest. Something small gleamed against his palm. Margaret's breath iced. "Trigger," she whispered into her mic. "He's gotta show me your hands," Greeley thundered as he cut in from the flank badge up sidearm low, an angled muzzle never crossing the crowd. Two uniformed officers mirrored him from the other side. Wide stance bodies bladed to keep the cart between them and the worst. The man's lips flattened. "Don't come closer," he said. The voice was wrong for the jacket, too calm. "This isn't about you." "It never is," Greeley said. He slid another step, attention locked on the man's shoulders, not the little piece of plastic and wire glinting in his right hand. "It's about the people behind us. Put your hands where I can see them. You can't guard everything," the man said almost gently. "Not the station, not the streets, not this." Whitmore's tone cut through cold and precise. "Signal suppression, live in East Sector. If he's carrying a transmitter, reduce his line of sight. Do not agitate. EOD 2. Mike's out." Michael didn't take his eyes off the suspect. He could feel the pulse in the base of his throat steady, by decision, not by nature. He'd stepped off the mat. Cameras would cut that moment 1,000 ways before sunset. He had no time to care. All that mattered was the angle of the suspect's elbows and the tiny tremor in his right thumb. "Hands," Michael said again. Not a request. The man glanced at the tomb, and for the first time his composure fractured. Awe, rage. It flashed and was gone. His thumb twitched once, twice, finding nothing. No response. No satisfying click. Margaret heard the tiniest sound of confusion. The sort a person makes when a door he's certain should open does not. "Doesn't work, does it?" Greeley said. Voice flat as a floor. "Technology's funny like that." The suspect's eyes flicked left, right, searching for a handler who wasn't going to save him. He swallowed. "It's not supposed to be quiet," he said. "Not here." "Then you don't understand this place at all," Margaret said, and even from 15 yards away her words landed. "Keep him in dialogue," Whitmore murmured on the net, not to comfort conversation. "Buys time. Box him." No sudden moves. A boy's voice piped from behind the rope, high, bright, impossible to miss in the hush. "Mom, that's the man. He's stopping it." The small certainty in the child's tone rippled outward, reseating people's feet on solid ground. The suspect squeezed his little device again harder, as if force could bulldoze radio physics. Nothing. Fury surfaced. He reached for the cart handle, maybe to yank it, maybe to topple it, maybe to do the kind of stupid thing desperate men do when the plan drowns. Michael moved first. The rifle butt stayed wedged. His offhand came up and hammered the cart's upper frame sideways, skidding the whole load 3 feet across marble with a scream of rubber. The cart lurched, smacked against a decorative plinth, and stopped dead. Enough, Greeley snapped. He surged, and the officers surged with him. The suspect tried to pivot. Michael's boot took his knee just enough to fold the joint without breaking it. A forearm drove the man into the cart's side. Plastic clattered to stone. Hands found wrists, elbows, leverage points. The suspect went down, face pressed to marble, breath hot through clenched teeth. Got him, an officer grunted. Hands secure. Back on the cart, Whitmore called. Hold the perimeter. EOD is here. The bomb technicians flowed in with the calm of people who trust their training more than their luck. Heavy suits, weird grace movements rehearsed until they look like instinct. One took the handle of the cart with a padded clamp and began to pull it backward along the path. Michael had carved a slow, patient retreat away from the tomb steps and into an open pocket of stone where a containment vessel waited like an open mouth. Margaret watched the tech's gloved fingers ghost over the cart's panel. She knew enough not to guess. She also knew enough to hate the silence, no beep, no timer, no overt theatrics. A simple box, a simple lie that might conceal a harder truth. Reading as low, a tech said finally. Wires are performative. Could be ballast. Could be worse. Treat like worse. Whitmore answered. Everyone clear 20 yards. People obeyed without argument. The plaza radiused wider. The tomb stood in the center like a fixed star in a sky being redrawn. On the ground, the suspect spat blood and opinion. You can't win all of them, he said. Our truth spreads. 1,000 cuts. Greeley crouched until they were at the same level, not to make philosophy, but to make sure the man saw his eyes. Tell your puppet master something for me, he said very softly. We don't need to win all of them. We just need to win this one. Then the next. Then the next. That's how stubborn people beat clever ones. The suspect tried to laugh and choked instead. They hauled him to his feet and walked him backward in a shuffle that preserved the neat geometry of the scene. Car. Whitmore's voice came private, a single line. Return to post as soon as you've got clear space. Yes, ma'am, he said. It would be the simplest line of the after-action report. It felt like lifting a mountain. He checked the anchors, the wedged wheel, the angle of the cart, the clearance around the tomb, and then stepped back the way he'd stepped off, counting the distance, as if that could stitch a cut. The rope line opened in quiet acknowledgement. He stepped onto the mat. The breath that left the plaza then was not a sigh. It was a reset. He lifted the rifle into its ceremonial rest, squared his shoulders, and took the first step. 21. Turn. 21. Turn. The sound of his boots erased the chalk outline of panic. In the command post, a tech lifted a thumb at Whitmore. Localized suppression still holding. If they wanted a remote boom, they'll have to come back in person. They just did, Whitmore said, watching the cart creep toward the containment vessel. 3 times today. EOD's lead gave the hand sign that means everybody should prefer to be somewhere else. The disruptor cracked a small, ugly pop. The cart shuddered. A panel blew sideways with a puff of shredded tarp. What spilled out wasn't shrapnel. It was bricks of clay wrapped to look like menace. Packed around them cheap phones with their batteries pulled wires, dead-ending into nothing. A theater set. An altar to fear with nothing on it. The lead tech's voice carried in a dry, almost offended tone. Inert. Greeley swore under his breath, not at the relief, but at the precision of the insult. He pulled us off the mat, he said. No, Margaret countered so fast and firm that both men looked at her. Her eyes were wet and defiant. We walked back onto it. Through the viewfinder of a long lens by the gate, someone captured the frame the exact second Michael's heel kissed the white line again, and the rifle came home to his shoulder. By evening, that still would do laps around the internet. The handler, wherever he watched from, would freeze that earlier frame too, the one where the guard stepped off, and tell himself he'd cracked an image the world believed uncrackable. He would ignore the one that followed. 2 officers rolled the inert cart behind a barrier like a prop being pushed off a stage between acts. The suspect in the vest disappeared into the care of men whose paperwork always outlasts headlines. The West Side gunman pinned and cuffed glared red-eyed into cameras that tried to make him central. He wasn't. He never had been. Michael's steps found their old precision. Sweat ticked down the ridge of his spine. His hand throbbed in time with his heart. None of that wrote itself into his posture. The boy with the flag reappeared as if conjured by the return of order and held it up again, no waving this time, just a steady little banner the way a child tells the world he knows which team he's on. Greeley came to the rope and stopped an arm's length away, respecting the boundary like a parishioner who understands sanctuary. When Michael's pivot carried him within earshot, the detective said, "You stepped off to stop a cart. Someone's going to try to make that the story." Michael didn't look at him. "Then tell them the rest." "What's the rest?" Greeley asked, not because he didn't know, but because he wanted to hear it said. "That we kept faith," Michael said. He turned a crisp right angle a mathematician would envy, that the tomb didn't lose a second. Whitmore stepped up beside Margaret. The two women looked like they'd known each other years instead of days, carved from the same scrap of resolve. "You saw it first," Whitmore said. "Again." "I saw a man pushing fear," Margaret answered, "and I saw another stand where fear told him not to. We all did our jobs." "You ever think of changing your name to Optimism?" Greeley asked dryly as he joined them. Margaret's smile was small, edged with fatigue. "No," she said. "Stubbornness fits." Across town, in a room that had changed twice today without the housekeeping staff ever opening the door, the handler sat in the dark and watched two still frames on a laptop, the step off the step back on. He tilted his head like a man trying to find a flaw in a diamond. "Annoying," he said again, but softer. He closed the laptop and slid it into a bag that had no monogram. His phone pulsed once. A message from the 7th floor shooter's number, now in evidence, arrived with a delay that told him someone had scraped it out of the ether for him. "You'll know when it fails." He typed an answer that no one would ever read. Not today. Outside, the sun leaned toward evening, washing the headstones in a warm light that made them seem less like stone and more like pages. Michael walked the mat. The wreath lay quiet. The crowd had thinned to those who understood they were seeing something worth staying for. The day had tried to break in 5 places and had failed in 5 different ways. At the end of his cycle, Michael paused. His eyes behind the lenses flicked once toward the place where the cart had scraped the marble. The scuff looked like a scar. Good, he thought. Scars tell you where you held. He took the next step. Night came on like a tide, deliberate and heavy, pulling the last light from the plaza. By the time the sun sank fully behind the Potomac, the tomb stood under lamps, soft white, that pooled on the marble mat, leaving the edges of the crowd in shadow. The day had bled itself into silence again. And yet no one really felt the same. Not the guards, not the officers, not the families who lingered as if their leaving would be a betrayal. Michael Carr's boot struck the marble in rhythm. 21. Turn. 21-1. Turn. The cadence was unbroken, but inside his chest, every step still echoed with what had almost happened. His body remembered the lurch of the cart, the tremor of the gunman's hand, the feel of his heel lifting from sacred ground. To the crowd, he was unyielding, the picture of ritual restored. Inside, the weight of the day pressed hard. Behind the cordon, Margaret slipped her jacket tighter and watched. Her notebook was open, but the pen rested idle across the page. She wasn't writing tonight. She was memorizing. She knew every line of what had unfolded would be poured out later, but now her duty was simply to witness. Her father's words returned again. Guardians stand until the danger passes. Witnesses remember when the danger tries to erase itself. Detective Greeley appeared at her elbow, the night pulling silver through his hair. "No more fireworks," he said. His tone was dry, but his eyes kept sweeping the rooftops as though daring another shadow to show itself. "You don't believe that," Margaret said. He grunted. "Belief doesn't matter. Pattern does. They'll test until they learn where the seams don't split." "And tonight?" she asked. "Tonight they learned marble doesn't crack." He scratched at his jaw. "But it cost us inches. Inches matter." Margaret closed her notebook. He walked back onto the mat. "That's what matters." They fell into silence. Above them, the lamps made halos of insects, and somewhere beyond the gates, the murmur of the city returned traffic, and laughter oblivious to how close the day had skimmed toward disaster. Whitmore's command post buzzed like a quiet hive. Screens glowed. Maps were annotated. The captured suspect had been processed, his face now threaded through databases of names, half-truths, and false passports. The word alias appeared more than once. The handler, the true mind behind the day, remained a shadow. Field teams report chatter in D.C. Neighborhoods and analysts said, adjusting her headset. Nothing concrete, just noise around the arrests. Whitmore nodded. Her arms were folded, shoulders drawn tight. Noise is better than silence. Silence means we missed something. She stepped outside to breathe. The lamps painted her uniform pale. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the quiver of gratitude, not that the day was over, but that the tomb still stood untouched. She saw Michael in the distance, rigid on the mat rifle tucked against his shoulder. And she thought, they came for him too, not just for Stone, for the one who holds it steady. Meanwhile, on the far side of the city, the handler sat in a dim cafe laptop, closed a cup untouched in front of him. He'd changed jackets 3 times since noon. He didn't look like a mastermind. He looked like another weary man in transit. The news on the overhead television showed split screens Michael Carr stepping off, then stepping back. The anchor's voice framed it as a moment of disruption answered by discipline. The handler let out a low chuckle. "You call that unbroken," he muttered. To him, the fracture was all that mattered. The step had been made. If one man could force it once, another could do it again. But even he could not ignore the second image. The guard's heel finding the mat rifle set the boy's small flag raised in mirror salute. The handler's jaw tightened. He closed his eyes briefly, and in that moment, annoyance curdled into resolve. Not finished. Not yet. Back at Arlington, Margaret finally rose. Her train would leave soon, but she delayed. She wanted one last circuit, one last look. As she turned, she caught sight of a young couple pressing against the rope. They weren't whispering, weren't restless. They simply stood, hand in hand, eyes fixed on Michael the tomb, the ritual. The man's shoulders were straight, his wife leaning against him. Margaret thought she recognized that look. It was the look of people who had carried folded flags home and now carried something heavier in their hearts. She stepped closer and asked softly, "Family here?" The woman's eyes glistened. "Our son," she said. "He never came back." This she gestured to the guard's silent walk. "This is where he still breathes." Margaret's throat tightened. She reached out not with questions but with the quiet solidarity of someone who knew grief's echo. She stood with them until Michael's next turn brought him facing the plaza again. He lifted his rifle pivot sharp, and the family straightened as though their boy had saluted them from another life. When Margaret finally walked away, she carried that image more than any headline she could ever write. At the command post, Whitmore keyed her mic. "Carr last cycle. You'll be relieved at 0200. Michael's voice, calm, filtered back. "Yes, ma'am." He did not shorten his stride. He did not soften the weight of his heel. He gave the tomb his full measure until the last second. And far across the city, a man with too many names whispered into the dark. "Next time." The day had closed. The night had opened. The story was not finished. The hours after midnight are when even brave cities grow thin, when the cadence of tires on distant bridges slows and sirens become punctuation rather than grammar. Inside the fence line at Arlington, the wind moved in long, slow washes through the oaks, and the lamps cast their steady halos over the marble like patient hands. Michael Carr's boots marked the mat with the same exact music they had at noon and dusk. 21. Turn, 21. Turn. The numbers did not shrink just because the world had. At 0047, Detective James Greeley signed a custody form with the weary flourish of a man who had made his peace with paperwork. The hoodie Marcus Lyle, 26, a courier with debts, and a bravado that had wilted in holding had finally given up the script. The phone in the duffel had been dead because someone told him dead props were safer than live consequences. The false EMT name, Joseph K., had gone quiet after a lawyer appeared like a conjurer's flourish in an empty hallway. But his boots matched a purchase at a surplus store 2 weeks ago. The 7th-floor shooter had been booked under yet another name fingerprints, now singing to databases that did not sleep. Each thread tugged led to other threads, an untidy bloom of aliases and second-hand parts. Greeley rubbed his temples and looked up at the clock. Night had stretched in that elastic way time does when you are tired, minutes like gum hours like snaps. He pushed back his chair and walked out into the cooler air beyond the command post where the hum of HVAC yielded to the softer breath of trees. From here he could see the tomb's lamp smaller than he expected at this distance, and the faint regular echo of a man walking a line. He let his shoulders fall the half-inch he had been withholding since dawn. Special Agent Dana Whitmore joined him carrying 2 paper cups that steamed. She passed one over. "Tea," she said. "From the volunteer. The red thermos. She keeps refilling everyone, and I haven't had the heart to tell her federal agents are supposed to subsist on rumor and burnt coffee." Greeley cracked a smile. "If rumor had caffeine, I'd be vibrating." He took a sip. It was sweet and medicinal, the kind of thing that announces itself as care. "Any love notes from our ghost?" "Our analyst pulled a fragment from a defunct message board," Whitmore said. "Handle we're attributing to the coordinator posted 3 weeks ago. Rituals are the easiest structures to crack. They reward disruption with attention." She blew on her tea. "He's not wrong. We've given him eyes all day. We didn't choose the attention," Greeley said. "But I hear you." Whitmore nodded toward the tomb. He did walk off the mat. Then he walked back on. Greeley countered. "If the enemy's metric is disruption, ours is restoration." Whitmore's mouth tilted. "I'll steal that for the after-action report." They stood without speaking for a moment, listening to the faint tap-tap of the metronome below. Night wrapped around their conversation the way a blanket muffles a child's dream. Across the lawn, a pair of deer ghosted between stones and vanished into darker shape. At 01:08, Margaret O'Connor stepped off the last bus of the night and told herself she was foolish. Her tiny apartment in Rosslyn held a bed and a radio and a lopsided bookshelf from a yard sale. It also held the kind of silence that transfigures a person's memory into a weapon. She had lasted 20 minutes with that silence, then wrapped her scarf and returned to the cemetery with a thermos under her arm. She flashed her volunteer badge at the gate and received a nod from a guard young enough to be her grandson. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "Who can?" she said simply, and kept walking. She found Whitmore and Greeley by the low wall. "I come bearing contraband," she said, lifting the thermos like an offering. "We were trying to be stoic," Whitmore said, "and failing." She took the thermos and poured. "You don't have to be here, Margaret." "That's the definition of volunteer," Margaret said. "We show up when no one requires us, and it matters more." She turned and looked down at the lamplit plaza. Michael's figure traced and retraced the same measured path, as if a compass needle had been set in motion. "How long does a body do that?" "As long as he's scheduled," Greeley said. "Relief at 0200. And then—" "He'll clean his rifle," Whitmore said. "He'll write another report. He'll probably wash his hands and stare at his knuckles and tell himself they've already stopped hurting. Then he'll sleep 2 hours and start again." Margaret nodded. "Then I'll stay until the relief comes," she said, "so someone sees him do it." Below, the air was cooler, as if the stone itself bled heat after midnight. Michael's legs had gone through stages. A runner would recognize the early burn, the dull ache, the second wind that isn't wind so much as a truce with muscle and will. At this hour, the pain was not loud. It was a bass line. He let it play. If he listened to other lines, the echo of the cart screeched the boy's high voice, the click that began the day that was his body's way of storing risk. He kept his breathing even. In the guard quarters, Specialist Herrera checked his watch for the 19th time and went back to polishing the brass he'd already polished twice. He was ready. Being ready made time meaner, and he accepted that math some fractions only resolve when you move. He'd watched the day like a man sitting in a theater and realizing halfway through the show that he is on the next bill. He would take the mat in less than an hour. He'd do it right. At 01:22, a subtle shift threaded the air too small for most to name. Margaret noticed it because she had spent nights in tents where power came from generators, and generators misbehaved. The glow over the plaza tightened as if someone had turned a dimmer down 2 notches. The lamps did not flicker. They swam. Whitmore straightened. "You feel that?" Greeley blinked. "Voltage sag," he said. "Grid work scheduled." Whitmore asked into her radio. A voice came back, negative. "No city notice. Our backup is green." Down on the mat, Michael registered the change the way a fisherman registers a shift in current through his calves. The shadows kissed closer ropes of darkness, drawing longer stripes across the stone. He did not alter his stride. The tomb stood white, becoming ivory inscription deepening into something that looked carved with a knife rather than a chisel. Whitmore's phone vibrated. A text from a number now flagged as related to the handler's cluster, "Ritual loves light." "Let's see if it loves dark." She turned the screen to Greeley. "He's taunting," she said, "and he's closer than I like." "Can he cut our feed?" Greeley asked. "Our cameras have battery failover," Whitmore said. "But failover and live aren't the same." Translation, Margaret said. "He wants a corner where eyes thin," where Greeley asked. "Every inch is watched. Every inch is watched." Whitmore agreed, but not all with the same devotion. At Arrow 129, a groundskeeper on the far fence line radioed a minor note that turned major in 3 words. "Breaker tripped east." He added a fourth. "Again." Again, Whitmore barked. "How many times? 3 in 10 minutes, he said. "Could be a bad box." "Or a good hand," Greeley said. Whitmore didn't hesitate. "Send 2 units. Quiet. No lights until they're inside the fence." She kept her voice even, but a slice of cold ran the length of her spine. The handler's last message from earlier in the day had been a simple instruction to his team: adapt. Tonight, no cameras. He had tried spectacle at noon. At night, spectacle was inefficient. Night rewards intimacy. Down in the quarters, Herrera stepped into the corridor, cap tucked under his arm. He felt the shift without needing to see the meters. He quickened his pace, then checked it. Quickness at the wrong moment is a tell. He gathered himself and went out into air that smelled like wet iron. Michael reached the end of his cycle and paused as always. The pause at night is different than the pause at noon. There is an extra breath in it, a pocket of quiet where something older than orders speaks. He let it speak, then turned. Near the service gate on the east side, a shadow separated itself from the hedge and became a man. No reflective vest, no toolbox, no cart. The absence of props made him clearer. He moved like water poured low shoulders down head at an angle that denied cameras the clean profile they crave. He reached the gate and produced something small and dark that met the lock with a confidence that told everyone watching he had been here before when no one watched. Eastgate Whitmore said into the air already moving, "We have intrusion." Greeley's feet were faster than his thoughts. He cut across grass staying in the shadow of trees to keep from throwing a long shape the intruder might catch in peripheral. "Unit slow," he cautioned. "He'll bolt if he smells a rush." Margaret did not run. She walked straight back toward the inner path that paralleled the service road. Not because she could intercept a man who had studied locks, but because people need to see other people stand when fear recommends retreat. The volunteers had taught her that the visible half of courage is for an audience as much as for the self. Michael saw the shape at the edge of his sight. He felt the tomb at his back. He heard distantly Whitmore's command, Greeley's caution, Margaret's quiet footfalls on gravel, like beads counted in a palm. He did not break the line. He did not leave his post. He knew this test in his bones. "Will you hold when holding hurts?" The gate clicked. The shadow paused, then slipped through, hugging the inside of the fence, as if the chain links could be a friend. He was not headed toward the crowd. He was angling toward the mat, toward the point where white stone meets darker ground, and a man's heel must lift and land again. If you want to crack a ritual, you don't always throw a bomb at it. Sometimes you try to make the keeper of it doubt. "Stop," Whitmore said, not loudly, but with that particular tone children listen to and certain men respect. The shadow did not stop. He glanced once toward the command post as if measuring the distance between decision and consequence, and kept coming. Greeley slid into his lane. "Hands," he said. "Let me see the hands." The man let one hand open. The other stayed near his jacket. Not at the waistline where guns live, but higher where a small can could be palmed, the kind that eats fabric, or writes messages faster than a scrub brush can erase. He wanted a mark on the marble. He wanted footage of a guard stepping off to stop it. He wanted a stain literal or metaphor. Whitmore drew a breath that tasted like metal. "Don't shoot unless he produces lethality," she said evenly. "We do not let him author this." Margaret's voice came up from a quieter place. "Sir," she called to the intruder, "you don't want to be the man who tried to write his name on the one place we keep for those without one." The man flicked his eyes toward her. It wasn't much. It was enough. Greeley moved, closing the angle. Two uniforms ghosted in at his shoulders. The intruder pivoted, not to flee, but to make himself larger the way animals do when they are cornered, and their only weapon is performance. On the mat, Michael reached his turn and stopped in the position that began his 21 seconds of stillness. He faced forward toward the plaza, away from the approach. He did not look back. The cameras would later make a meal of that, a man refusing even to track his own would-be defiler. But it wasn't showmanship. It was a choice to let his duty name the moment, rather than the man who sought to steal it. The intruder's shoulders dropped a fraction. That too was a tell. He drew the small can from his jacket in a burst of motion meant to surprise. Greeley's hand found his wrist. A uniform's baton kissed the intruder's forearm in a short, mean arc that didn't break but persuaded. The can fell clattering, rolling into a puddle of lamplight where anyone could see it was only paint. Only paint, as if the word only could domesticate intent. Down, Greeley ordered. They put him down. The grass took the impact like a confession. "Lock the gate," Whitmore said. Her voice had lost none of its edge. "Walk him the long way. I want him to see every stone he thought he could walk past to make himself larger." Margaret reached the rope and stopped a single line of breath between her and the mat. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence said more than any commentary could. Michael heard the scuffle conclude. He heard the handcuffs' quiet clicks. He heard, too, the way the wind changed as if the grounds themselves had exhaled. He kept his count through it all. At the end of his pause, he turned, lifted his rifle, and began again. At 01:57, Herrera arrived at the edge of the plaza, uniform, immaculate eyes steady, jaw set, with that particular mix of pride and humility the old guard cherishes. Whitmore signaled with 2 fingers. The relief would be on time, and on time was as sacred as anything else there. Greeley walked the east path with the intruder under escort. He did not speak. The man did not either, perhaps, because the view answered everything, stone after stone, names and ranks and dates, and beyond those plots with no names, just the weight of bodies and the idea of them. By the time they reached the gate again, the intruder's bravado had thinned into something closer to human. Why, Greeley asked finally. The man shrugged a small, embarrassed gesture. "He told me it would matter," he said. "Who?" He stayed quiet. But the wince that crossed his face at the word "who" told Greeley what he needed, not zealotry, not ideology, just a man recruited by a voice that promised importance. At 02:00, the change of guard commenced. The commands were low and exact. The exchange of responsibility spoken like vows in a chapel, this post, and its responsibilities are now yours. Michael answered with the clarity of a man who had earned the right to be tired. Herrera received the charge with shoulders that knew the weight they accepted. The ceremony threaded itself through the edges of night and tied off the day. When it ended, Michael stood 1 heartbeat longer than necessary, the way a man lingers at a door he has closed, making sure the latch caught. He stepped off with no wobble. Whitmore met him halfway and did not offer the kind of praise that cheapens. "Report," she said, and he gave the necessary words, and no more. Margaret waited until he finished and then held out the thermos as if it were a medal. "You held," she said simply. He took the thermos and nodded once. "We held," he corrected. Greeley joined them, his eyes grit-sore and satisfied. "Someone told our friend over there that if you crack the ritual, the people will lose the story," he said. "I think we taught him the story's bigger than a step." Michael looked past them to the mat where Herrera had already found cadence, the sound of his boots rising like a familiar song. "It is," he said. Somewhere in the city, a man closed a laptop and turned his face toward the window where he could not see the tomb, but he could feel it like a pressure in his ears. He had sent men with guns and dead phones and theater props and a can of paint. He had almost found a seam, and then he had not. He would vanish now, the way certain men do into flights that aren't on boards and rooms with doors that don't latch from the outside. He would tell himself patience is genius. He would convince himself rituals are brittle. But something older than his patience had outlasted him tonight, and it would be there tomorrow. 21 turn. Michael flexed his bruised hand. It hurt. He welcomed the hurt. Pain is a record proof of contact, proof of refusal. He would sleep not long, not deep, and he would dream of a scuffed line on marble where a cart had tried to write deterrence into stone. In the dream, a boy would hold up a flag in the exact spot where the scuff was, and that would be enough. The lamps hummed, the oaks whispered, the guard walked, and those who had remained to watch discovered that at 2 in the morning, the silence at Arlington is not empty. It is full. Dawn did not burst over Arlington, it seeped. The first faint gradient of gray along the horizon bled slowly into pale rose, then deepened to a gold that found every crease in the marble and made each carved name momentarily radiant. The city beyond the cemetery stirred with commuter engines and subway rumbles, but within the gates there was only the persistent cadence 21 turn, 21 turn. Specialist Herrera on the mat now walked with a precision that seemed borrowed from the earth itself. Michael Carr had slept 2 hours no more. His cot in the quarters had not softened since midnight, but fatigue softened the body in its own way. He woke with the kind of start veterans know no alarm, just the body's declaration that duty outruns rest. He scrubbed his face in cold water, examined the knuckles that bore last night's memory, and dressed again. He carried no pride in the bruises. He carried them the way a carpenter carries calluses, signs of work done, not boasted. In the command post, Detective Greeley hunched over a table strewn with reports. The intruder from the East Gate sat in a holding cell downtown, already processing through a system that would not let him out before lawyers had measured every inch of his story. Greeley knew the man was small fry. The hand guiding him was larger, more deliberate, and still loose in the dark. He tapped the rim of his coffee cup and muttered, "He's still out there." Special Agent Whitmore glanced up from her laptop. She had already typed 15 pages of preliminary assessment, each sentence crisp enough to stand in a hearing. "Yes," she said, but his tempo broke. She turned the screen so Greeley could see the analyst's summary. Each move last night was faster than the last. Panic leaves footprints. Margaret O'Connor arrived with the sunrise scarf drawn close around her throat. She looked older this morning, but steadier too, as if the hours of darkness had given her spine an extra rod of steel. She brought another thermos, set it on the table without ceremony, and asked, "How many did you stop?" "Enough to call it a victory," Whitmore said. "Enough," Margaret repeated, eyes drifting toward the plaza where Herrera's rifle caught Dawn's first spark. "That's never as many as it should be." Michael joined them in silence. He poured tea, drank, and said only relief was flawless. Whitmore studied him. She wanted to say more, to acknowledge that he had carried a day designed to break him, but praise in the wrong measure felt like vinegar on stone. Instead, she said, "You gave them nothing. That's the report." Outside, the first tourists of the new day gathered at the ropes. They shuffled hushed and stared with the reverence of people who had seen headlines and now wanted proof with their eyes. They did not know the mat had been nearly breached at 1 in the morning. They did not know the marble had nearly carried a painted word. All they knew was that the guard did not waver, and that was enough to knit rumor back into reverence. At 07:30, the Secretary of the Army arrived unannounced. His sedan glided to the curb, and he stepped out in a suit that fit like a verdict. He surveyed the plaza, then the command post, then the volunteers. His eyes lingered on Michael's bruised hand. "You walked off," the Secretary said without preamble. "Yes, sir," Michael replied. "You walked back on." "Yes, sir." The Secretary nodded once. "That's all anyone needs to know." He clasped Michael's shoulder, not softly, then turned to Whitmore. "Get me a clean copy of every camera feed. The President will want to see what I saw." "Yes, sir," Whitmore answered. The Secretary paused. "The story must be unity, not fear. Make sure your language remembers that." Then he departed as briskly as he had come, leaving only the low rumble of tires against stone. Greeley exhaled. "Well, that's one way to deliver a sermon." Margaret, standing with her scarf in the morning breeze, murmured, "Unity is not a story. It's a decision." By noon, news outlets carried the sanitized version, "Attempted vandalism foiled at Arlington." Grainy stills showed a man in custody shadowed enough to erase humanity. Other clips showed the guards' relentless pacing boots like punctuation marks on marble. What they did not show, what no camera had captured, was Margaret's voice cutting the night, or the bruises forming on Michael's knuckles, or the whisper of oaks that had borne witness longer than any reporter. Michael sat in the quarters with Herrera during shift change. He passed along the logbook, each line neat and squared. "Post secure," he said. Herrera nodded, then asked quietly, "What does it feel like, Sergeant?" "When you know the whole place leaned on you." Michael considered. He thought of the boy with the flag, the screech of wheels, the can rolling into lamplight. Then he said, "It feels like walking. One step, then another. You don't measure it until afterward, and by then it's someone else's turn." Herrera absorbed that with the reverence of a student taking notes in a class no book could teach. He took the mat. Michael stepped off. The line endured. That evening, Margaret returned once more. She carried no thermos, no scarf, just herself. She stood at the rope as families gathered, as children hushed, as strangers laid hands on chests without being told. She watched Herrera's boots strike the marble in the exact cadence she had heard Michael carry for 24 hours. She whispered a prayer not for safety, but for endurance. In the city, the handler watched the same feed on a cracked laptop. He replayed the failed moment again and again, the can slipping the guard, not flinching, the people stepping forward when they should have stepped back. His mouth tightened. He closed the laptop and sat in darkness. He told himself he would adapt. But something in him understood the ritual had not cracked. It had bent toward resilience. That was a harder enemy than stone. Night fell again, the lamps hummed, the air grew cool. Another guard traced the mat rifle gleaming. Another 21 seconds. Another turn. The crowd thinned, but did not vanish. The volunteers stayed. The detectives lingered. And the tomb endured as it always had, not because marble resists paint or men resist fear, but because some stories refuse to be rewritten. Michael sat on his cot, head bowed, hands clasped. He felt the ache in his bones, the weight of fatigue, and the quiet pride of one truth he had held and the line had held with him. Tomorrow, another man would stand. Tomorrow, the story would begin again. And somewhere deep in the marrow of the night, between the breaths of oaks and the hum of lamps, Arlington whispered its lesson to those who would listen. Duty is stronger than disruption, and memory is stronger than fear. If you like the story, consider sending a super chat to help bring more similar stories. Now click on the video on the screen to hear another story that is equally powerful and compelling, with courage, sacrifice, and a choice that makes you question everything you know about duty and justice. Click on the video.